Hello, everybody. Welcome to the March Newsroom Analysis. Welcome back if you are a return viewer, or welcome in if it's your first time here. Hi, my name is Beck Griffin, and this is the Deep Dive Project, which is my venture in independent citizen journalism and research. The monthly newsroom analysis is a segment that I started doing last year where I pull monthly headlines that are relevant to the subjects that I research and discuss. And at the end of the month, I sit down and I read through them. I offer my opinion and perspective. And it's provided a fantastic way for me to keep my finger on the pulse of a number of goings on relevant to the work that I am doing. And also, it has opened my eyes and broaden my horizons, my understanding of just how interconnected we all are here on planet Earth, because I don't just pull from North American or English speaking news headlines, I pull from all over the world. So we're reading news from the Philippines and from Poland and from South America and from Europe and North America and Canada and all over the place. And so it has really driven home for me the fact that nothing happens in a vacuum. None of these events are transpiring in a vacuum. Everything is having an impact on everything else. And while I am not here to fearmonger or alarm, it's not hyperbole to say that ignorance is a luxury that we and millions of innocent people cannot afford. So my end goal here with the Deep Dive Project is to encourage my audience to think critically, even though that can be very, very difficult if you were never really taught how, and to ask our own questions and to do our own research, to dig past the headline or past the hyperlinked article that seems to satisfy whatever point the original author is trying to make. And it's incredible, the information that you can find when you just go on the internet. It's all out there for anyone who wants to see it. So that is what I am trying to do here. Obviously, I am not a journalist by background or trade, but I don't have to be to talk about these issues. The Deep Dive Project as a whole is just my place to give my perspective and opinion on matters related to human rights and public concern. So, with all of that said, I will be doing my best to pronounce everything correctly, but again, because I'm pulling from diverse media pools, not everything is in English, and I use a web translator on my browser to translate to English so that I can read everything, because as of yet, English is the only language that I am fully fluent in, although I am working very, very hard on Spanish as well. So, give that out there right away. I mean, no offense if I mispronounce anything. And then last but not least, and this is only just because I got into a back and forth with someone over on Instagram over this, I feel the need to say, although I feel like this should be obvious, the takes that you are going to be getting here on the Deep Dive Project are not going to be unbiased, if you can believe it. I do not believe in unbiased journalism, in the fact that I don't believe that it exists, because I think we all have biases, whether or not we are aware of them. They impact how we absorb information and how we interact with the world. And I have never tried to present myself as a unbiased or as a one-stop shop for information of any sort. I am giving you my opinion and perspective, so it's going to be heavily colored by my own biases. And those biases, in general, when it comes to the subjects that I discuss, are that these organizations and these people are harmful and are not doing any good in our world and need to be removed. That is my bias. And so I attempt to introduce the nuance, because there is so much nuance involved in that, as much as I possibly can. But at the end of the day, you're getting my opinion and my perspective, and it's not going to be an unbiased one. So if that is what you are looking for, you should try to find it somewhere else, and good luck to you, because like I said, I don't really believe that it exists. But I feel like I should probably just say that once for the public record, because apparently there are people out there who think that I am some sort of unbiased fountain of wisdom, which is simply incorrect. you can listen to the things that I have to say, but you should form your own opinions at the end of the day. And you should be doing some of your own research to inform those opinions. I'm not here to be your one-stop for any information whatsoever. It's certainly not unbiased information. I would be doing you a great disservice if I attempted to present myself that way. And so I am not interested in doing that. So with all of that stuff out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the first article here, which is a doozy and maybe one of the hardest hitting articles in my little pile for today. So this is from Politico. This was published on March 4th by the Associated Press. The headline says, "Sprawling investigation finds decades of sexual abuse among Catholic priests in Rhode Island. About 75 clergy who preyed on hundreds of children since 1950 were protected by bishops in an effort to shield the church's reputation, according to a new report." Catholic priests in Rhode Island preyed on hundreds of children for decades and were protected by bishops more concerned with the church's reputation than the victims, according to a new report on clergy sexual abuse that echoes findings elsewhere. So this is not an old report that has suddenly seen the light of day. This is a new report that reflects the Catholic sphere in Rhode Island's treatment and handling of clerical abuse all the way up to present day. This is not solely concerned with shit that happened back 100 years ago. So keep that in mind. This is a new report with new information that indicates systemic and historical behavior, criminal behavior. The report, released Wednesday by attorney, because I don't know how you could call protecting predators anything other than criminal. How that could be perceived as anything other than criminal. It should be criminal behavior when you are knowingly aiding and abetting predators. Right? The report, released Wednesday by Attorney General Peter Noronha, follows a multi-year investigation into the Catholic Diocese of Providence, Rhode Island. Noronha said the full scope of the priest abuse problem in Rhode Island, the smallest U.S. state but the one with the highest Catholic population per capita at nearly 40%, has long remained elusive. He agreed with victims who say not enough has been done to address the problem long after it was exposed in the nearby Boston Diocese in 2002, and that is, of course, in reference to the Boston Globe's Spotlight investigative report. And there's a movie about it, which if you have not seen, you really should, because it's incredible. Quote, "If you're at the Diocese of Providence and you're listening, this is a scandal you need to own and you need to fix," Noronha told reporters Wednesday. "We can't slow walk solutions and we can't slow walk justice." Noronha, who was raised Catholic, hopes the report will spur legal reforms to boost investigative powers and help victims seek justice. The investigation found that 75 Catholic clergy molested more than 300 victims since 1950, but officials stressed that the number of victimized children and abusive priests is likely much higher. We're talking about 75 identified Catholic clergy who abused more than 300 people since 1950, but that's just what's been identified. The officials are saying that it's probably much higher numbers, more priests, more victims. And this is just for the state of Rhode Island, just for the Archdiocese of Providence. The diocese, in response, acknowledged the scourge of child sexual abuse, especially by clergy, but said the report reflects the church's willingness to share internal records under a 2019 agreement with the state. The report presents this 75-year history in ways that might lead the viewer to conclude that these issues are ongoing diocesan problems or that there are new revelations. They are not, the statement says. So the diocese is attempting to downplay, I think, the severity of the impact of this report. Church records, that's how it reads to me. Church records show the diocese transferred accused priests to new assignments without fully investigating complaints or contacting law enforcement, a practice exposed in investigations in Boston, Philadelphia, and elsewhere. So this is a modus operandi that has been well identified. It's practically pathological. And as in other cities, the Diocese of Providence opened a spiritual retreat style facility in the early 1950s for accused priests to seek treatment. Later, when the abuse was deemed a mental health problem, priests were sent to more formal treatment centers. So, starting out back in the day, when in the early 1950s at least, they were keeping it in-house as much as possible, at least for the Diocese of Providence, and we also know that it is the case for Philadelphia and Boston as well, and elsewhere. They say that they would keep it in-house by sending these predators to facilities that were owned by the diocese, not to facilities where they were actually going to be seeing some type of like authority in like predatory behavior, presumably. Because forgive me, but I just cannot help but feel that these spiritual retreat style facilities were functioning as anything other than a hiding place, considering the fact that the problem continued to be ongoing and so severe. So these weren't contributing to the solution in any way, shape, or form. So it's hard for me to feel like they were really doing anything all that worthwhile. And I think I could be forgiven for feeling that way. By the 1990s, accused priests were sometimes placed on sabbatical leave. So we've got these spiritual retreat style facilities, these internal retreat style facilities, these more formal treatment centers, and sabbatical leave. That has been the historical response to identified predators in these places. For example, a priest named Robert Carpentier resigned after a victim came forward in 1992 to say that he had been sexually abused as a 13-year-old victim in the 1950s. Carpentier acknowledged the abuse and was sent to a treatment center and later on a sabbatical at Boston College. He retired in 2006 and received support from the diocese until he died in 2012. Most accused priests, the report found, avoided accountability from both law enforcement and the diocese. Norona's office has charged 4 current and former priests with sexual abuse for allegations stemming from 2020 and 2022. So these are recent. 3 of them are still awaiting trial. The 4th priest died after being deemed incompetent to stand trial in 2022. Only 20 people, about a quarter of the clergy identified in the report, faced criminal charges, and just 14 were convicted. A dozen others were otherwise laicized or dismissed. And my biggest question with these laicized and dismissed people, is what happened to them after that? Because it's not as if they just like faded into the ether and disappeared. They were still alive and kicking, still living with all of their presumed proclivities. And what happened to them? They went on to go and live in communities elsewhere. And were the people in those communities aware of the fact that these predators were taking up residence? I'm asking because I don't know, and that seems to be something that is kind of conveniently left out of the narrative. It's always, oh no, yes, we had some abuse cases with so and so, but we dealt with those, and this person has been removed from active ministry and placed in retirement, or something, some flavor of that. You know, we've seen that a million times, right? Well, what's happening after that with these people? Is there anything, like, are they required to check in? I know sometimes if there's been some type of criminal proceeding, they may be required to register as sex offenders, but I'm under the impression that that is not like par for course rule across the board, particularly if there have been no like actual criminal or civil charges brought. They get shuffled around and forgotten about. And then what happens? I feel like it's a recipe for disaster. One survivor described being groomed more than a year before he was abused by the pastor of Immaculate Conception Church in Cranston in 1981. The survivor, who is not named in the report, said the late Monsignor John Allard showered him with attention. By ninth grade, he said the sexual abuse began in the priest's bedroom. His comment to me was always, "You need a hug," and that's something that I can hear him saying very clearly to this day, the survivor told officials in 2013. While a review board deemed the abuse credible, the Vatican, at the urging of then Providence Bishop Thomas Tobin, let Allard retire rather than be defrocked. The report lists Tobin advocating for several accused priests, a trend that Noronha repeatedly criticized. Quote, "I just don't know how you square it. If he's got an answer, then he's free to send it in," Noronha said. The diocese, in a statement released Wednesday, praised Tobin's willingness to work with Noronha while he was bishop before retiring in 2023. Separately, in at least one case, a member of the Diocesan Review Board hearing abuse complaints was himself accused, the report says. The Reverend Francis Santilli stepped down after the complaint, but remained in active ministry even after other complaints surfaced in 2014 and 2021. He was not removed until 2022. A message left at a possible number for him on Wednesday was not immediately returned. So, I have a thought, but I'll keep reading for a moment. Noronha launched the investigation in 2019, a year after a Pennsylvania grand jury issued a landmark report that found that more than 1,000 children had been abused by some 300 priests since the 1940s. However, Rhode Island law does not allow grand jury reports to become public, a hurdle that Noronha has long tried to change. Instead, he forged an agreement with the diocese to access its trove of records on clergy sexual abuse. So, Noronha started this investigation in Rhode Island in 2019, which followed a year after there was a Pennsylvania grand jury landmark report that found that more than 1,000 children had been abused by some 300 priests since the 1940s in Pennsylvania. So that was a Pennsylvania-centric report. And I remember when that report came out in 2019, because at that point in time, I was in the throes of a very difficult religious Catholic deconstruction. And this report coming out at the point that it did, when I was already asking so many critical questions and already learning so many things about Catholic Church history that I had simply never been told as a cradle Catholic growing up in conservative Catholicism in the Midwest. This report was not the straw that broke the camel's back for me for leaving the Catholic Church, because it was a death by 1,000 cuts for me. But it certainly helped move me in that direction, because that report echoed the findings of the Boston Globe Spotlight report. And both of those reports are echoing the findings of this new report from Rhode Island, which is that there is a systemic and historical problem of human rights crises in the Catholic Church that it cannot get a handle on. And the thing that I was coming up against, just speaking personally at that point in time, was that I did not see how I could continue to call myself a Catholic, knowing the things that I knew then and know now, and feel like I was being a part of the solution in any real or meaningful way. And so I left. And the whole deconstruction journey thing is not really something that I have talked about a lot here on the Deep Dive Project, because while this channel is me giving my opinions and perspectives, so it's sort of a solar system of my own creation with me in the middle, my goal isn't to talk about myself. My goal is to raise awareness for human rights issues and to promote public education and all these other things that I said at the beginning. It's not really about me having this axe to grind, although I know that there are people who would prefer to think that that was the case and that I was only doing this because I have some vendetta. But that's not the truth at all. I just didn't feel like I could be a part of the solution anymore. And I know people, have met people, have interviewed people who are on the other side of that, who are still in the Catholic Church and are actively working to be the change that they want to see. And I find them to be exemplary people, and I have a lot of respect for them. And I sincerely hope that their hard work and their efforts produce fruit, because they deserve that. And people in organized religion across the board deserve to be able to gather and worship freely and safely without fear of predation. So I have a lot of respect for people who are still Catholic and working very hard in that space. For me personally, that wasn't something that I felt like I could do. That's my own personal journey and everything, though, and we're all on our own. Anyway, that's a bit of a diversion, but I wanted to mention that just because they mentioned this 2018 investigation out of Pennsylvania, and that is something that stands out to me as very significant in my life history and in my journey of leaving the church. Learning about the reality of the human rights crises in the Catholic Church made it very, very easy for me to make the decision that I made. And I think that the church and organized religion in general, right, because this isn't a solely Catholic problem, is going to continue to hemorrhage and fail to garner the sort of mass appeal that I think they would like to, particularly if we're talking about Catholicism or evangelical Christianity here in the United States. They're not going to be able to do the things that they want to do if they cannot contend with reality as it is now. And I feel like there's a lot of push and pull happening between this sort of old guard idea that you need to protect your own and keep everything in-house, against the more modern and, in my view, correct perspective that no, these things need to be handled publicly and out in the open, and the people that are involved, the victims, need to be the number one priority, and everything else. So anyway, again, I'm sorry for that little bit of a sidebar, but it was relevant. I feel like it's relevant to share personal anecdotes here and there when it has something to do with the larger overarching conversation that I'm having here, which in this case is just about abuse and the Catholic Church and the fact that it is so incredibly prevalent. It says Rhode Island law does not allow grand jury reports to become public, a hurdle that Nerona has long tried to change. Instead, he forged an agreement with the diocese to access its trove of records on clergy sexual abuse. The church turned over 70 years' worth of material, including complaints from its secret archives, civil settlement records, treatment costs, and other documents. Yet, Nerona called the diocese help limited at times, saying it refused to provide diocesan personnel for interviews. Nerona criticized the diocese on Wednesday for treating the report as ancient history, arguing that more needed to be done by clergy leaders to address ongoing concerns about abuse. His office outlined multiple changes for the diocese, which includes providing clear investigative timelines and guidelines. He also stressed the need for the diocese to abandon the practice of requiring victims take a polygraph test and to stop refusing to investigate third-party complaints about priests. So, at this point in time, it is patently impossible for the Catholic Church to deny an awareness of the plethora of abuse issues that it has happening under its roof. And it is impossible for it to deny that it has no better way forward, that this is simply some bug or feature of human nature that we're simply going to have to contend with or something like that, because there have been so many people coming forward saying, hey, here's a safety protocol. Hey, here are some measures that you could implement. Hey, maybe we need to alter this or that hierarchical structure a bit so that it doesn't favor predators quite so much. But those haven't been popular efforts at all. And in fact, a lot of them have appeared to have been met with resistance, which is strange behavior from a church that would apparently want to be perceived as being a part of the solution, because they said in its response Wednesday that the report would not have been possible without the church's cooperation. So they're saying, well, no, anything good that is currently happening is purely because we're cooperating. We're doing what we're supposed to do. Bishop Bruce Lewandowski said there are no credibly accused clergy in active ministry. Today's Catholic clergy here in Rhode Island are good and holy men serving Christ and his people with devotion and out of genuine pastoral concern. And of course, we would love to be able to believe that that is true. And I am sure that there are a number of good people who are living out their vocation to the priesthood or whatever other religious life within Catholicism, and who are doing that faithfully and with good intentions and in the best possible way. But unfortunately, at this point in time, I don't really think that we can just take their word for it and assume that everything is fine. Not with reports like this coming out decade after decade, with stories coming out year after year, and with all of them having many of the same features of suppression and diversion and abandonment, frankly, of the victim and the other parties negatively impacted and abused. So as much as I would love to take Bishop Bruce Lewandowski at his word, the bar is in hell. And I simply don't believe him. I simply don't believe that all of the clergy there in Rhode Island are good and holy men. Not when you have, let me scroll back up here and find it. Not when you have reports from, they had said 2020 to 2022. The Rona's office has charged 4 current and former priests with sexual abuse for allegations stemming from 2020 to 2022. And then they said that the 3 of them are still awaiting trial, with the 4th passed away and was deemed incompetent to stand trial anyway. So I can't even believe that this is a past problem that is no longer applicable to current conditions. Because it's not as if 2020 and 2022 were like ancient history or something, you know? So that's a major problem for me when it comes to like reading this and interpreting the information and what everybody is saying. I mean, I can't lie. I have no. Why should I believe anything that they say? Why are they in any way? Have they demonstrated? Has the Diocese of Rhode Island demonstrated that it is in any way, shape, or form worthy of being trusted after there's been a report that there were all of these priests who preyed on hundreds of children for decades? Where was the figure? 75 Catholic clergy molested more than 300 victims since 1950. So over the course of, what is that, like 80, 90, almost 100 years, this was playing out in the Diocese of Rhode Island. But the Bishop of Rhode Island, Bruce Lewandowski, expects us all to believe that everything's different now. Even though there are credible reports from this decade and within the last, like, not even 5 years, 2022. For Herbert Brennan, who was repeatedly abused by a Rhode Island priest in the 1960s, the diocese response is disappointing but not surprising. Quote, "If one wants to learn the teachings of Jesus Christ, they should read the Bible. If one wishes to understand the Catholic Church, read this report," Brennan said. And unfortunately, I think that he's probably right. And while I have not read this report, and I didn't read the 2018 report either, based on the articles that I read discussing those 2 reports, it's clearly pointing to a historical and systemic problem within the Catholic Church that's not landlocked to a specific country or region, and also that is not sequestered to just the post-Vatican II or church of the like postmodern world, even though there are so many people who would love for everyone to believe that that is the case. This is simply false. There's a 2,000-year paper trail of abuse, verifiable by using the church's own documents, and there is research that you can find and read about this very thing by, and I feel like if I had a dime for every time I mentioned the work of the late Dr. Richard Sipe et al. Oh my God, check it out. Please, if you haven't, it will open your eyes. It will really open your eyes to this problem within the Catholic Church. So, moving on, changing gears, I have been talking a little bit this year about a situation that is happening with a Catholic organization called the Society of St. Pius X, or the SSPX, which is another conservative Catholic society that has also been accused of having some cult or sect-like tendencies, and has also had a very contentious and tumultuous relationship with the Vatican. And there's a situation happening right now with the SSPX wanting to ordain their own bishops against or without papal approval that is presenting a bit of a potential schismatic situation for the organization and the Catholic Church, and it's pretty interesting. And so I found this article, which is it's a Q&A that's very, very short, but it gives the perspective from a Catholic POV on why this is a problem for the SSPX to be wanting to ordain their own bishops. And because this is a Catholic organization, it's sort of necessary to look at it from a Catholic perspective if you're going to understand why it is an issue, or why the conversations that are being had are being had. So this was published March 5th. Written by Jenna Marie Cooper on the Southwestern Indiana's Catholic community newspaper, The Message. And the question says, I've read a lot recently about how the Society of St. Pius X is planning to ordain new bishops this summer without the Pope's permission. Why is this such a problem if the SSPX are all validly ordained anyway? And the answer, the big picture, quick, short answer, is that the SSPX proposed episcopal ordinations are a problem because ordaining new bishops without the permission of the Pope, technically called a pontifical mandate, is gravely injurious to Christian unity and is a cause of schism, or like fracture, basically, within the church, for lack of a better term. If you're familiar with the fallout with the Calvinists back in the day, when John Calvin decided that he'd had enough of the Catholic Church's shenanigans, or the Martin Luther, when he pinned his big notice to the door of the church and said that he didn't want to be a part of what they had going on anymore, and like went off and started the Lutheran Church. These are all examples, and there are many more than that, of course, obviously, but these are examples of like instances where there was a schism, where a group of people, or someone leading a group of people, intentionally went against the teachings of the church, or what the church was wanting them to do at that time, and were declared in schism with the Catholic Church. And the history is pretty interesting, and the impact on our world and everything because of that is also very interesting, but the subject of schism is for a different day, and probably for someone who is better educated in like church canon law to talk about, which would not be me. I've not really studied canon law at all. It is true that a validly ordained bishop has the power by virtue of his ordination to confer the sacrament of holy orders on other men. This includes the power to ordain laymen as deacons, deacons as priests, and priests as bishops. So, if a bishop attempted to ordain a priest as a bishop without a pontifical mandate, the sacrament would still work and would result in a new and real bishop. However, while such an ordination would be valid, it would be illicit, that is, against the law, and gravely so. In fact, canon law applies one of its most severe penalties for those directly involved with the ordination of a new bishop without a mandate from the Pope. As per Canon 1387 of the Code of Canon Law, both the ordaining bishop and the new bishop who received the illicit ordination from him, quote, incur a latae sententiae excommunication reserved to the Apostolic See. This means that both men are excommunicated automatically as soon as the mandateless ordination takes place, and their excommunication can only be lifted or reversed by the authority of the Pope. The reason why canon law comes down so hard on this particular crime is because of ordaining a bishop without the mandate of the Pope, and especially if this happens against the Pope's express wishes, is strongly connected to the sin and more foundational crime of schism. So the Catholic Church teaches that it's a crime and a sin to be in schism with the Church. The Canon 751 defines schism as, quote, the refusal of submission to the Supreme Pontiff or of communion with the members of the Church subject to him. A Catholic can be schismatic on an individual level, such as if a lay Catholic personally and deliberately decides he or she will no longer obey the Pope or follow the laws of the Catholic Church, though each situation would be studied for verification of the excommunication. I guess technically, if you wanted to get technical with it, that would mean that like someone like me, who was raised a cradle Catholic and then left the faith later on, would be in schism with a church, or could be, because once you're a Catholic, you're always a Catholic, and if you were raised a Catholic and had the truth trademarked from the like earliest moments of your life, and then you decide to leave knowing the truth trademarked, then the negative outcomes are even worse for you than they would be for someone who was never raised Catholic and who was invited to convert at some point and then rejected it. It's worse for the person who was Catholic who left than the person who never was. And I think that is pointing to this whole like concept of like schism, being in communion with the full body of the Church, blah blah blah. The negative effects of schism are multiplied exponentially when a bishop ordains new bishops totally on his own initiative, since this has the potential to create a sort of parallel church by which large numbers of the Catholic faithful might be drawn out of communion with the legitimate successor of St. Peter and the visible church with which Christ himself founded. The Pope is the vicar of Christ, chosen by the Holy Spirit, to whom the keys of the kingdom have been given. For background on this particular situation, the SSPX, or the Society of St. Pius X, was founded by Archbishop Marcel, and I'm not sure how the pronunciation on this last name, Lefebvre, in 1970. Originally, the society was founded in the proper canonical way as a pious union, at this time the first step toward becoming a recognized religious community. But then in 1988, Archbishop Lefebvre consecrated 4 new bishops against the explicit warnings of the Holy See. So they've done this before. In his July 2, 1988 apostolic letter Ecclesiae Dei, Pope John Paul II recognized this as a schismatic act and formally declared that the bishops involved were excommunicated. Over the years, popes since JP2 have made efforts to reconcile the SSPX to full communion with the Church. For instance, in January 2009, Pope Benedict XVI lifted the automatic excommunication of the surviving affected bishops as an act of mercy and pastoral concern for their souls. And at various points in Pope Francis' papacy, the SSPX members were granted the ability to validly and licitly receive absolution for their sins and to celebrate marriages, all in an effort toward reconciliation. Recently, however, the SSPX rejected the Holy See's offer for theological dialogue and confirmed its intention to proceed with the episcopal ordinations. If the SSPX were to go forward with the ordination of new bishops without a papal mandate, this would likely restate the state of their dialogue with Rome to where it was in 1988. And this was written by someone who holds a licentiate in canon law. So I would expect that they would know the canon church position on this whole SSPX situation, which is very, very interesting. And I'm going to continue to kind of just see what happens and how this all plays out. In my view, things are already kind of headed towards schism, if not already actively in schism, just because the SSPX has declared that they are going to proceed with ordaining their bishops, and as the author said, if that happens, then they'll revert back to that 1988 schismatic like state of existence or whatever, which would pretty much put them and everyone with a conversation back to square one. So pretty interesting, and like I said, I'll be keeping an eye on how this plays out going forward. But I thought that since this is a Catholic situation and it's a Catholic organization and it's like Catholic infighting at its finest, it's good to understand the Catholic perspective on why it's being viewed as problematic. So there you go. So I'm translating this next article to English from Spanish. And it says here, Juan Cuatrecasas, the father of a victim of abuse in the church, is quoted, "It doesn't compensate for the damage, but it helps to achieve justice." The spokesperson for the Stolen Childhood Association has praised the agreement with the church on Hoy por Hoy La Rioja. So this was published March 30th by SEI2, I'm guessing. It's a Spanish news site, Radio Rioja editorial, and they write, this is from Logroño, "The new system for providing reparations to victims of abuse within the church will be implemented on April 15th. This is outlined in the protocol signed this Monday by the government, the ombudsman, and the church, which does not establish a fixed financial compensation for the victims." So this is in regard specifically to the Spanish church. I believe there have been some developments in recent years with the church in Spain specifically trying to move forward with having productive dialogue with victim survivors and trying to provide reparations and safety protocols and that sort of thing. I've seen quite a bit coming out from them. They've also been publishing some things talking about the reality of clerical abuse and spiritual abuse, what it looks like, and how it manifests. So it seems like in Spain, there is a push to have a more up-to-date and modern and comprehensive conversation and way to help people, which is good to see. But of course, the question of how effective it's actually going to be is still very much there. In La Rioja, Juan Cuatro Casas knows firsthand the suffering of the victims. His son was sexually abused by a teacher from La Rioja during his time at the Opus Dei school Gatzalueta in Bilbao. And I have also talked about this situation pretty extensively. I've published some things across my social media about this case and about the former Opus Dei member and teacher who is now a convicted pedophile. What is his name? Maria Martinez Sands, maybe, I believe. Let me look up. Let's see what his name is. I always like to say the name whenever this case comes up because I don't think that people should forget about this and forget that there was a very real predator at the center of all of this. And the experience of the family in trying to get justice has been really sad, honestly. Really, really sad. In this article, they don't say his name. Let's see. Maria Martinez Sands, Opus Dei. Yep, that's him. That's the name. Jose Maria Martinez Sands, a former numerator of Opus Dei and teacher at the Gatzalueta School, was expelled from the prelature by the Vatican on March 3rd, 2025, following a canonical sentence by Bishop Jose Antonio Satue. So the father of that victim has been incredibly vocal about trying to get justice and reparations for victims. According to the spokesperson for the Stolen Childhood Association, this agreement does not compensate for the harm done to the victims, but it does help to achieve justice and good work has been done. Quote, "I believe a very efficient job has been done. I know that it has been done by the Ministry of Justice, the State Secretariat for Religious Freedom, and the Ombudsman. This work will continue, and we have full confidence in that," end quote. Cuatro Casas defends the role of the victims and the associations and assures that for them it is a guarantee that the ombudsman is the one overseeing this process because he denounces that the Episcopal Conference has already deceived them on many other occasions. Quote, "I must also recall, after hearing Arguello's statements, that we had already proposed a series of measures in a 10-point plan at a meeting in Añastro. We were told that it would be implemented, but they didn't implement any of it. The new system of reparation for victims of abuse in the church will be launched on April 15th. And they are considering that victims who have gone through the PRIVA PRIVA plan can be included in this system in a complementary way." So there are developments. The advocates and activists are saying it's not enough, but it is something. And so we should acknowledge that when those changes are coming. It is so slow, though. Within the same theme, there's kind of been a theme with these last few articles. This was from Los Angeles Press. Language and Sexual Abuse, 1 Week to Assess. This week's text is about abuse by clergy or otherwise, its consequences, and how the Catholic Church and the media uses language to describe it. This was published March 23rd by Rodolfo Soriano Nunez, and it's a lengthy article, full disclosure, but they give some really interesting historical context and background here that I think is important if you want to understand this issue within the Catholic Church in a comprehensive way. When the Boston Globe, Corrective, and Mediapart break the myth of sexual abuse as pedophilia in the Spanish-speaking world, this is insisted upon, while Portuguese and Italian media ignore the facts. So this is a really interesting article about the disparity in reporting of events across the world in different religions, or different regions and languages. Last week will go down in history as one of the most intense for understanding the future evolution of the clergy's sexual abuse crisis. From the palaces of Rome to the grape fields of California, it was a week for discussing abuse and how abuse is discussed. On Monday the 16th, Pope Leo received British financial journalist Gareth Gore. I have another article talking about that more in depth here in a minute. He gained worldwide recognition after publishing a book and a series of articles and interviews about Opus Dei. Unlike previous encounters, even with some survivors of that organization, the Vatican released some information about the meeting. A few hours later, Leo held a public audience with members of Tutela Minorum, the entity tasked with preventing clerical sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. What Pope Prevost said was as expected. Unfortunately, it was the way the Vatican Communications Office handled the information that has observers wondering if the Catholic Church has learned anything from the more than 40 years of this crisis. Well, it's a hell of a lot more than 40 years. And that's a good question because I'm wondering the same thing. On Wednesday, the United States and Mexico were shaken when the New York Times published a story about the numerous cases of sexual abuse perpetrated by Cesar Estrada Chavez, the Mexican-American human rights activist and union leader who was a key player in social movements in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. The devastating revelations about the extent of the abuse shattered Chavez's previously revered memory. This was especially true given his frequent use of stylized designs of the eagle devouring a snake from the Mexican flag, mixed with traditional and avant-garde representations for the aesthetic of the 1960s of the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. When Chavez and his movement did it, they sought to stir up memories in Mexico and the United States of the times the religious icon has been the banner to mobilize Mexican communities around the world. As has happened with many Catholic priests, the use of Our Lady of Guadalupe became a trap. The icon that mobilizes support, solidarity, and mutual protection since the epidemic of 1737, the Matlsowatl epidemic of 1737, and later during the Mexican War of Independence, became a pretext for Chavez's abuse of power against those working for the common good of Latinos in the United States. On Thursday, media outlets in several countries published accounts of what has been known for several years about the practices Rome employs to minimize the reporting, understanding, and discussion of cases of sexual abuse by clergy. So you can understand why, I think, when the Archbishop of Providence, Rhode Island, says that everything's all hunky-dory over there present day, I am not inclined to believe. Because we have all of this investigative work that has revealed the practices that Rome has used to minimize reporting, understanding, and discussion of cases of sexual abuse by clergy. It's been well established. It says, unfortunately, there are enormous differences in how the issues were portrayed in different languages around the world. Although the Boston Globe followed its own path to delve into the root causes of the sexual abuse crisis, in the Spanish-speaking world, the media behind the publication were unfortunately willing to support one aspect of the Vatican's narrative on the crisis, as the Spanish newspaper El País framed the issue with the biased logic of pedophilia. By doing so, at least in the Spanish-speaking world, what remains is the exclusion of cases of sexual clerical sexual abuse where the targets of the abuse were adults at the time of the crime, as is the case of many victims of Renato Poblete in Chile or Marco Rupnik in Europe, to name just two well-known super predators whose victims were adult women. The Opus Dei one that like pops to the top of my head is the late Father C. John McCloskey, who was such like a public figurehead for Opus Dei in the United States, and who ended up costing the organization a lot of money because he could not keep his hands off of his adult female parishioners. This text addresses abuse as a reality, a constant, and how institutions and the media use language to describe it and to position themselves in relation to it. What changes between English, French, German, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese is not the evidence itself, but how and whether a religious or media organization says anything about the reality of abuse. What emerges is not a stable hierarchy. It is a mosaic of many possibilities for addressing a painful and devastating reality. At Vatican News, it is a small group of monsignors who decide how and even whether a text is published. In secular media, when the issue truly matters, there is almost always a point at which someone, the owner or the editor-in-chief, must make a decision about whether the story gets published or dies. And if you want to learn more about the media landscape and how the sausage is made, so to speak, when it comes to the stories that are published and the information that we gain access to, there is an incredible book, you can find it on audiobook as well, called Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow, who's a very famous journalist who did a lot of work exposing the crimes of people like Harvey Weinstein, for example. And in his book, he talks about the ways that really important stories about human rights abuses, are eventually chilled and killed before they ever see the light of day. And it's really, really interesting. Pope Leo's meeting with Gareth Gore is particularly significant because Gore's work focuses on the financial and internal power structures of Opus Dei. By acknowledging this meeting, the American Pope signaled to the English-speaking world a willingness to engage in dialogue with critics. He also points to the Spanish-speaking world, where the base of Opus Dei remains, that despite the many accusations leveled against Gore by the once powerful prelature, Pope Prevost does not dismiss the many criticisms made by Gore in his books, articles, blog posts, and social media. Although there was no official report of the meeting, and it is likely that the Pope was already familiar with Gore's work, Rome's decision to let the world know about the encounter with the author makes the potential outcome of the imminent reform of the organization founded by Jose Maria Escrivá de Balaguer in the 1920s all the more significant. And that is a good point, I think, and one that is worth highlighting, because it's not as if, I find it very unlikely and hard to believe that Pope Leo is in any way, shape, or form in the dark about this organization, Opus Dei, or about the state of human rights abuse in the Catholic Church more broadly, because of his track record and the decisions and things that are accredited to him, particularly from when he was Bishop of Chiclayo, Peru. I find it dubious to believe that it would be so silly to think that he doesn't have any idea about these very, very important situations and the people who are working to expose them and everything else. But because the Catholic Church is as much a political and governmental entity as it is a religious organization, the things that they do, the people that they meet with, the statements that are made, people flock to those to try to piece through and pick through and find meaning and reason for the things that are being publicly shown, because the Vatican doesn't put it all out there like on the front page for everyone to see. As we've been discussing all this time, they kind of have a history of doing the opposite, keeping things behind closed doors. So when there is something very public like this and the Vatican publicizes it and talks about it, it is going to catch people's attention, because it seems like it's a signal maybe of an attitude or perspective that is beginning to take hold, more so than it is just a couple of people meeting together to just like have a conversation over a cup of coffee or something like that. And so within that context, this meeting is very significant and could offer insights into how Pope Leo is going to handle Opus Dei going forward. Of course, that's all just speculation. We are left like with crumbs to try to like paint a full picture of what is actually going on, because again, there is no like, the public is not entitled to know anything. So you're left with what you are left with. Gore's merit lies in the fact that, thanks to his access to the financial documents of Escriva's order, he was able to offer a complex and coherent account of how Opus Dei profits from religious devotion and obedience. His work also offers a structural template for understanding similar dynamics of religious value extraction in the Legion of Christ in Mexico, the Argentine Institute of the Incarnate Word, and other similar order-like organizations that have used vows and oaths to bolster their financial statements. Because Opus Dei is not really in any way unique or special, which is something that I am sure they would never admit. But I am of the opinion that there's nothing unique or special about Opus Dei, because so much of the like structural character and charism of the organization are all based on the writings of the founder, Jose Maria Escriva de Balaguer, which he based on stuff that he read in like other books and writings from like other church religious leaders and whole like order founders and things like that. And he sort of like clobbered this whole thing together with bits and pieces from other traditions or orders that he liked, basically. So the end result is that there really is nothing tremendously unique or original about Opus Dei. And that's sort of a double-edged sword in a big way for them, because not only are they not unique or special, but once you understand how they work, you can kind of take their the symptoms that they're exhibiting, and you can start to see them popping up in other organizations as well, and you can draw conclusions about what's actually going on there based on what you see because of this context with this organization. And that's something that I've done myself when I have looked at organizations like the Legion of Christ or the Sodality of Christian Life, the SCV, because it's very obvious once you start looking that these organizations that have been accused of having these cults of personality around their founders, they tend to follow a very similar playbook. And I think that there's a reason for that, just because the ways to overcome and subjugate the human will are already so clearly understood and identified that you don't need to reinvent the wheel in order to break the human will and use it for your own ends. You just have to look at how it's been done by other places and other people. Robert Prevost has had a difficult relationship with Opus Dei. When Pope Francis appointed him Bishop of Chiclayo, Peru, the now Leo took charge of an entity that had been under bishops of Opus Dei or affiliated with that organization, as recounted in the text linked after this paragraph, published in May 2025. And that is about the SCV, in case you were curious. In addition to the problems he had in changing clerical approaches in Chiclayo, he was a front row witness and potentially a part in the bitter dispute of Pope Francis with the now Archbishop Emeritus of Lima, the first Cardinal of Opus Dei, Jose Luis Cipriani Thorn. When Francis was already ill in January 2025, Cipriani defied the pontiff by returning to his former diocese to attend public events in clerical attire, despite the specific sanctions issued by Francis and originally accepted by Cipriani, who, tempted by the opportunity to return to Lima and play the master of the universe, ignored Francis' punishment. Worse still, when the Argentine pontiff finally died, Cipriani strolled through the streets of Rome and St. Peter's Basilica, once again in clerical garb, but despite the restrictions imposed by Francis. These restrictions were an old-school way of symbolically punishing Cipriani. There we go again with the symbolic and meaningless gestures. for punishing him for the sexual abuse of a minor while he was an Opus Dei priest in Peru in the 20th century. However, in retrospect, they also become a moral lesson for the current pope, who needs to decide now whether he will insist on that old school approach, which for the most part achieves nothing. The effects of restrictions on predatory clergy can be traced from Marcial Maciel to Cipriani, and it can be seen how, in the end, they are a mere semblance of any real penance, and worse still when one moves from canon law to civil or criminal law. Most painfully, at least when one puts oneself in the shoes of the survivors, in these matters the ultimate mockery is directed at the witnesses. Instead of real punishment, some Monsignor in Rome used the Spanish newspaper El País in early 2025 to leak the file on Cipriani's case. By overlooking the shock value amplified by the version published by La Republica's article in Lima of the El País, little of value was achieved. So they leaked this information and apparently did not present the shock value as it was presented in La Republica in El País. And so the impact of what had actually happened was pretty softened. And the plight of many Peruvian journalists who suffered Cipriani's threats of endless punitive litigation was validated as he used Peru's highly restrictive media legal framework against them. This is relevant because of Opus Dei's disproportionate influence on the Peruvian judiciary, an influence as pervasive as that documented by ProPublica for the U.S. Supreme Court, a translation of which was published by Los Angeles Press and appears after this paragraph. According to various accounts, Cipriani served as a de facto mediator and moral guarantor for Alberto Fujimori in his approach to judicial matters. This relationship allowed Opus Dei to place sympathizers in high-ranking positions within the judiciary. Now, what does that sound like? It sounds very reminiscent of things that have happened here in my own country in the United States. And I actually have a video that I made just recently talking about Opus Dei's efforts to disrupt the church-state separation here in this country. With a model similar to that of the Federalist Society in the United States, the University of Piura, run by Opus Dei, became the main training ground for a conservative legal elite that sees the law as a tool to impose its idea of moral order, which prioritizes institutional protection over human rights and extends that approach to protect individuals accused of serious human rights violations. In both countries, the strategy was the same: to capture the mechanisms that control access to justice and thus define what is a crime and what is not, what is just and what is unjust. In Peru, it was the Ministry of Justice and the Episcopal Palace in Lima. In the United States, it was the list of judicial nominations and the donors of dark money who, from the far right, financed the Supreme Court's ideological shift. In both cases, as also occurred in Nicaragua, the fight against abortion was a convenient pretext for enlisting the support of the Catholic Church. Unfortunately, as was later seen in Vatican News coverage, Pope Prevost's openness towards gore and further to the issue of the widespread effect of clergy sexual abuse crises did not translate faithfully to the Catholic faithful in Latin America and Southern Europe. Although Vatican News, the true media outlet of the Holy See, was willing to report on Pope Leo's meeting with Tutela Minorum, the Vatican News seemed trapped in the idea of offering a contradictory and segmented account of what the current pontiff is doing regarding clergy sexual abuse. While the English text of the meeting with Tutela Minorum was as clear as possible in narrating what happened, emphasizing the need for bishops to truly prevent abuse, the Spanish text of the same activity is a relic from the 90s, a time when the Catholic Church still said that the crisis only occurred in the English-speaking world. Instead of emphasizing the Pope's call to protect, the Spanish version used a watered-down message asking bishops to listen to the victims, so quite a tone change. The difference is not merely academic, especially when the authors are as different as the texts themselves. The English text was signed by someone named Deborah Castellano-Lubov, and the Spanish text is a translation of an Italian one that was signed by someone named Benedetta Capelli. Anyone who takes the time to find out how Vatican news works will notice that the French language version of the meeting, which is closer to the English version, is signed by Alexandra Sirgant, and although different from the English text, is closer to it than the Italian and Spanish texts. So there's differences in the information that is being presented to people depending on the language that it is being written in, which is strange. The German text, signed by Anne Prekel, offered yet another approach, one that emphasizes the role of cooperation in achieving guardianship's objectives. Even if some differences in the way a global media outlet like Vatican News approaches what should be perceived as a key activity for the reigning pope are logical, the differences in tone and attitude found in the more emphatic and clear versions in English, French, and German, and the ambiguous and vulgar account of the Italian and Spanish versions are remarkable. And I would agree. I'm scrolling down. This is a very long article. And if you want to read any of their supporting sources in here that they have linked, you can find it. But I mainly wanted to get those main differences identified, and then the conclusion more so. The abundance of news last week made it impossible to follow other developments, including some in Asuncion, Paraguay. Furthermore, late Friday, a Belgian bishop, Johann Joseph Boni, the Diocese of Antwerp, launched what some interpreted as a challenge to Rome, his decision to identify potential candidates for the priesthood among married men and ordain them in 2028. So this is a separate thing from the SSPX thing, but they're also talking about ordaining their own people. But these people would be married men, which would be quite a diversion from historical practice in the church, which is that, all clergy are required to be celibate. So now there's this conversation about Bishop Boni wanting to ordain these men who are married. And there's been more discussion of that as well. The main thing that I wanted to draw your attention to was the differences in how information is being presented. And if anything, based on the language that it's published in. And if anything, I think that makes it even better that I am not just reading from like one single source of information. I pull from a lot of different places, because it would be great if you could trust the information that's published, right? That's released to the public. It would be great if you could believe that that is always absolutely accurate, but we know that that isn't the case. We know that media is often used more so as propaganda, as a way to propagandize a population of people. And so I think that's why it's important to try to break out of the information silos that we are so easily trapped in, to take in a broader perspective and try to see the forest for the trees a little bit. Because imagine if you live in Portugal and you are only reading about this situation from that Portuguese source, you're going to be getting something that's quite a bit different from what everyone else is getting who's reading it in French or in English. And that's not good when you're talking about trying to create an environment in a church, a religious organization, where everyone has access to reliable and accurate information, and where everyone is on the same page. That's not going to contribute to that outcome in any way, shape, or form. So the fact that that's happening is quite concerning, and something that I think we always need to be aware of, because it's not as if, again, this is just something that the Vatican is doing. Media entities all around the world, they have multiple interests. I just don't think, in my opinion, that you can always take what is published in the black and white and read all over as gospel truth. I think media is used to propagandize very, very often, and so it's important to not get locked into only going to one source for your information. You need to diversify your input streams a little bit, your informational input streams, so that you are getting something that's a little bit less watered down and is a little bit more representative of fact. And it sucks that we have to like be on our toes so much and be so critical not only of these organizations and these people, but also of the methods by which we're receiving the information. But that's the world that we live in, and we absolutely have to. So, in the vein of diverse media outlets, this is an article. This was an undercover investigation that was conducted by Jordana Seal and published through the Daily Mail, which is pretty interesting. And I want to read this article because it's really interesting and it reveals so much. And once again, it continues to validate what so many people, former members and activists and journalists and people such as myself have been saying about this organization, pointing out the problems, because this is an undercover investigation of an Opus Dei like center, basically, where people live. And this happened over in the UK, but Opus Dei is a global organization, and if there's one thing I think you can count on, it's that they replicate themselves pretty much identically wherever they go. And so if something is true in one place, more than likely there's when we're talking about like structurally and that kind of thing, the day-to-day life, how life is ordered for the members and everything like that, if it is one way in one place, it's most likely going to be the same in another geographical place. And I think that it's important to keep that in mind, because that lies at the crux of the case of the 43 women in Argentina, 43 members who are alleging that they were labor trafficked. The Argentine federal government is now taken up the case and is bringing charges against leadership, Opus Dei leadership in the country and everything. And the thing about that case, and what is so important to remember, is that while it is landlocked to Argentina, it is not a solely like Argentinian problem, or it does not just exist in this one like random outlier. And I've seen a number of attempts by Opus Dei and people supportive of Opus Dei and people who just generally don't seem to like to see religious organizations getting called out for the toxic and harmful things that they've done, that this case with the 43 is some like outlier, far out example that's like happening somewhere. There's these 43 random people and their lawyer that are trying to cause problems, but that's not actually being honest about the scope of the situation. And the scope of the situation, the way that I understand and believe it to be, and the perspective and position of numerous victim survivors, is that that situation in Argentina is emblematic of a systemic issue within the organization globally. And so while Opus Dei might like to just have everyone believe that it's this random outlier case that is in no way, shape, or form indicative of anything else within the organization, I am of a very different opinion. A lot of people are of a very different opinion. And this article, coming from an English-speaking country out of the UK, certainly reinforces that perspective. And I think you'll see what I mean as I read through this. So the headline says, Britain's School for Tradwives Who Are Married to God. Jordana Seal goes undercover at secretive Catholic sect Opus Dei, where young women give up their careers to cook and clean for men they never see, take a vow of celibacy, and punish themselves. This was published on March 28th. To crowds strolling along Maresfield Gardens, nestled in the heart of leafy Hampstead, there is nothing noteworthy about Lakefield Hospitality Training College. So this is a domestic training school, which is something that I've talked about quite a bit and have interviewed people who have gone through these facilities. But anyway, the ugliest building on a street flanked by a £1.5 million red brick townhouse and imposing mansions, you could quite easily ignore it altogether on your way to pick up a pastry at one of the many artisan bakeries a short stroll away. But let me see if I can make this. No, the text is like really close to the line and almost cutting it off, but I think you guys can still see to read along. Lakefield isn't just a cookery school. In fact, it's a multi-million-pound gated complex run by one of the world's most notorious Christian sects, Opus Dei. Referred to as a cult by former female members, Opus Dei has recently been at the center of high-profile slavery, sexual misconduct, and financial fraud allegations in Catholic countries, including Italy, Ireland, and Argentina. However, in the UK, they operate in the shadows, owning multiple properties in Glasgow, Manchester, Oxford, and London, alongside women-only university halls of residence in the heart of London and Manchester. As part of a 5-month investigation, a Daily Mail journalist posed as a university graduate seeking guidance from a female member of the sect living inside the Hampstead property that has a fingerprint scanner on its front door. And the thing that I wonder, what immediately pops into my head when I read that, is whether or not there is a fingerprint scanner on the other side. Because a feature of these like Opus Dei residences, particularly the ones where male members live and where female only assistant numerary servant members care for their every need and whim, there is a feature of these like double locked, double barricaded doors, complicated systems of locks and methods basically intended to keep the men and the women separate at all times. I mean, they can't even acknowledge each other like when they're bringing meals at like mealtime or anything like that. It's something that when I interviewed former assistant numerary Anne Marie Allen, who wrote a book about her experience being in Opus Dei in Ireland, in her book, which is called Serve, and you should read it or listen to it, she talks about these like double barricaded doors where there were locks on both sides. Now, this is taking things, you know, to the talking about a fingerprint scanner on the front door. That's upgrading things to like the 21st century here. But I have reason to question whether or not the same sort of modus operandi isn't still in place, where on the other side of that door, you also have to scan your finger to be able to leave. And that means that there's someone controlling access. Certainly there's someone controlling entry, which is not necessarily a bad thing on the face of it. Like, I don't have a problem with people securing their homes or their places of work or anything like that. But, you know, we're talking about an organization that has been accused of being very controlling and overbearing in the lives of its members, including not permitting them to leave at will. So, again, is there a fingerprint scanner on the other side of that door? I would be very interested to know. In echoes of Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel, The Handmaid's Tale, we found that a group of young women live inside, spending long days cooking and cleaning for more than 40 male university students and priests, but are banned from speaking to them. The female devotees live a life of celibacy and are encouraged to wear a painful spiked metal garter around their legs as a form of penance and commitment to God. Their leisure time is also controlled, and while they are permitted to drink alcohol at social events, they are only allowed to watch U-rated Disney films on television. And those social events, I don't think are, like, multitudinous. Our reporter was offered mentoring by Erin. There's an asterisk there, so I'm assuming that name was changed to protect her identity. A bespectacled girl on the cusp of 30 who had given up a successful career in lab research to join Opus Dei. She explained that women living inside the home are consumed by their duties to male students, working 6 days a week with just 1 day off while living in adjoining halls of residence called Netherthal House. Inside the pristine residence, there are stacks of freshly starched shirts, boxer shorts, and trousers draped across the second floor. But despite this dedication to male residents who live just yards away, Erin admitted that she had never met them in person. Wearing a modest engagement ring to symbolize her spiritual calling, Erin compared herself to a mother who would selflessly care for her family. Yeah, except that when you're caring for a family, you're actually allowed to, like, communicate with your family and have relationships with your family members in, like, a free and open, like, exchange of, like, ideas and thoughts and everything, which I am not under the impression happens in Opus Dei in any way, shape, or form. So if it is a family, it seems like a very, very dysfunctional one to me. And I don't think it's surprising that people report having so many problems once they're in it, because it is so incredibly dysfunctional. The key difference being that Erin, who met our reporter every week for a month, had taken a vow of celibacy as soon as she joined Opus Dei. I'm not going to get married because, as an organization, we always need people who can give their lives to actually run the things, she explained. Within the Opus Dei centers, there are some people who choose to give up their professional job and work in the home, like the work of a mother. So we look after all the catering and the management of the house itself. That becomes our profession. We don't live together, but it's the same complex. We don't see them, it's separate. They have their own dining room, we have ours. So here on the screen, this is a picture of the spiked chain that is worn around the member's leg. It's called a cilice, and then this cloth rope here is called the discipline, and they use them to mortify their flesh, because in Opus Dei there's this idea that you constantly have to be like hyper vigilant against your every thought and every emotion. You have to constantly be like actively engaging with like examining your conscience and every little small thought and notion that pops into it, so that you can then go and when you have your chat with your spiritual director, you can tell them all of your like innermost thoughts and feelings, ostensibly under the guise of providing spiritual direction. But I believe, and many former members have said, that it's really just a way to collect information on members and to enforce a surveillance state, essentially, in which members are themselves the prisoners and also the guards of the prison. Here's a picture of the front. It says Lakefield Hospitality Training College on it. They have like a bulletin board here advertising something called like a family cook-along. And other events here. It says like other dates. I'm sure nothing about Opus Dei on this Lakefield Hospitality Training College sign or on their bulletin board, I'm sure. Here's the chapel on the inside. And then they had a picture. I scrolled past it. Here's that door that has the thumbprint reader right here. If you're watching on video, if you're listening, it's a wooden door and it has like just an unassuming handle, but you can see like the little black circular thumb scanner right above the handle. Anybody who's worked in any type of like building that had security or anything like that, I'm sure you're familiar, seen something like that. And again, I don't have any issue with it. Like, you gotta keep your things secured and everything. And I obviously am in support of that. But I really would be interested to know, like, who all's thumbprint is accepted in that door. Is it everybody who lives there, or is it only a few people who have been deemed as like responsible enough to have access to the door to exit the compound? I think you could see how this potentially, and I'm not saying it is this way because I don't know, I don't live there, but I think you can see how this could potentially become a very toxic situation very quickly. Erin said some women chose to work outside the accommodation, which has been operating since 1962, but as a result have to pay Opus Dei residence fees. Meanwhile, she lives there for free and is paid not very much, but enough. Does she have full control of her finances? Or is she expected to hand them over to her the directress, basically? Because that is something that a lot of former members have talked about, that especially in modern times, that yeah, sure, they are paid and they have an electronic paper trail showing that there's funds being deposited into their accounts, but they either don't have control of the accounts or they are required to transfer a sizable portion of their income to the Opus Dei Center. The women typically spend all their downtime together in a shared living room watching U-rated films deemed acceptable by senior members of the sect, because you can't make those determinations for yourself in this environment. Everything has to be determined for you because you're a silly little woman and you can't do that for yourself. Can't use your silly little brain. Throughout the mentorship, our reporter was encouraged to lie to her family, partake in self-harm rituals, and hounded about the importance of connecting to God through menial housework. Quote, "We're all sinners, and we have to make up for it," Erin preached in one session, and the people who live celibate lives can use traditional means, meaning in this case self-harm, to do so. She went on to describe corporal mortification, whipping yourself, and wearing a spiky garter known as a cilice as normal in the church, and explained that it's an act decided between the member and their spiritual director. Well, I disagree with her statement that it is these corporal mortifications are a normal feature of like Catholic Church life, because that was certainly not my experience at all. And I had a very, very, very conservative Catholic upbringing, and I was very familiar with the stories of church saints who did use corporal mortification as a part of their spiritual practice, like St. Thomas More, who got beheaded by King Henry VIII. He was really popular for having worn a hair shirt as part of his mortification. And then there have been other saints as well who have done all sorts of things, everything from the cilice and the discipline and the hair shirt to more extreme, less extreme types of mortifications that are intended to purify the flesh and bring you closer to God, ultimately. And while there is a history in the church of people having used these kind of extreme mortifications, like the cilice or a hair shirt, that typically is not something, based on my understanding and what I was told growing up, it's not something that the Catholic Church really encourages most people do today. One, because there are already so many other ways for you to mortify yourself if you want to. You know, you could simply give up coffee, or start skipping desserts on Fridays, or abstain from watching any type of like secular media entertainment except for the weekends, or whatever. Like, there's already all of these different ways that Catholics can get creative about like mortifying themselves, but it's not necessary to go the extra step of actually physically harming yourself, which, if taken to their extreme ends, and many people have and do, these methods of mortification will hurt you. The spike chain will cut your skin open. The whip can leave welts and bruises, I am sure, especially if you're someone like me who like can just be barely touched, and I bruise like a peach. So like, I can only imagine for somebody like me, something like that, it will cause physical harm and even lasting damage. I mean, I've read stories on like Opus Libris, for example, from people who talk about how they still have scars on their thighs from where they wore that cilice day after day, years on end, while they were in Opus Dei. It's not really something the Catholic Church encourages. And there may be outlier examples and situations where people on a one-on-one case basis decide to do something, and maybe they have some guidance from a spiritual director. I don't really know. But to say that these things are normal in the church is wrong. Now, they may be normal in the church of Opus Dei, but they're not normal in the Catholic Church, right? Because Opus Dei has been accused of being a church within a church, being a church hiding within the Catholic Church and taking Catholic Church teachings and kind of running with them and inventing their own twist and translation on them. So I disagree wholeheartedly with the idea that that's normal. It's not normal. This is not normal. Normal Catholics are not doing this kind of thing by and large. Most women in the house are numeraries, celibate members who are banned from interacting with men. Inferior to them are their less educated celibate counterparts, assistant numeraries. Quote, the assistant numeraries are the only ones who ever see the boys, the numerary said. When they're in the dining hall, they, the boys, have a bell in case they need something. If they ring the bell, the assistant numeraries go in like waitresses. Their routine consists of serving strangers through a shared door that opens onto a huge dining room. Multiple times a day, the women set dozens of round tables and set out homemade food before locking themselves away. They'll then proceed to clean up, sift through huge bags of washing carelessly left for them. They do all of this while wearing a cilice. Comparing intermittent fasting and trendy cold plunging to punishing herself with cold showers and depriving herself of sugar, the numerary justified sacrifice for spiritual means. She said, it's normal for people to make sacrifices for an aim. Yeah, but this isn't quite the same thing. Here's a picture, here's one of the founder himself in all his glory, and then here's a picture of the street that this training center is on. Very pretty. And then here's a screenshot from their webpage. It says, as a female only NVQ from 18 to 24 years old, Lakefield Hospitality College is dedicated to empowering you, young woman, on your journey towards success. We're here to support you every step of the way. Join us and let us help you unlock your full potential. And they have two courses you choose from, either professional cookery or hospitality service. And I would be very curious to know what their graduation rate is like, how many people, graduates of these programs, have gone on to seek employment outside of Opus Dei in other for other businesses or other entities, because that's another like feature and bug, is the fact that these like courses and things seem to serve as more of a recruitment means than as a way to actually educate people for gainful employment. Erin told our reporter she had her mini conversion from standard Catholicism to Opus Dei at university. So say even in here, they're admitting that like Opus Dei is something else besides just Catholic. It's not just Catholic. It's gone an extra little distance. And she had her mini conversion to it while she was living in private halls of residence while she was going to university that were owned by the sect. And isn't that a tale as old as time as well? Stories abound from people who only encountered or learned about Opus Dei after they agreed to living in this private hall of residence that they needed to live in while they were going to university to save money, or because they wanted to be in a more like home-like environment, or whatever the case may be, who don't hear a whisper about Opus Dei until they have already moved in and are living there. And then Opus Dei starts making an appearance. So, of course, Erin discovered Opus Dei while she was at university and living in a residence that the organization owns. Of course. Discussing the central London halls called Ashwell House, she said they started the university residence with the aim of helping people that age. So when you live there, you get all of the things that they offer. That may be true, but again, also I feel like there is a recruitment element at play in this as well, because it just seems like, I'm sure there are examples, but I just have not heard any, of people who already knew that these student residences were Opus Dei student residences because maybe they had come from an Opus Dei supernumerary family and their parents are super involved. All the kids have always been super involved in like the extracurriculars and things, which are often facilitated through these student residences and such, so that once they reached the age of attending university, they were already planning to live there while they were going to university. I'm sure that does happen, but that doesn't seem to be the norm. The norm is that people are sort of between a rock and a hard place, or need accommodation so that they can further their education, and they sort of get shuffled and encouraged into moving into this residence, where they then hear about Opus Dei for the first time, even when some of these people were friends with people who were members of Opus Dei for a couple of years before they moved into that residence. So all of that really contributes to this feeling that these residences are not there so much to provide a place for someone to live, as they are a really handy way for Opus Dei to gather similar people together who are the type of people that they want to recruit, to target for recruitment. So Erin says, I went to Imperial College London, and even though it's a good university, the only thing the students, did after classes was drink, so I didn't get to do anything. But I had really good friends in Ashwell. It's a place where I feel safe. Under the guise of providing female students with an alternative to UK university party culture, teenage girls are encouraged to move into the sect's central London accommodation in bustling Shoreditch and live by an ultra-strict set of rules. This includes restrictions on speaking to male students and rarely leaving the accommodation alone, enforced by members of staff who live inside the halls. And as Opus Dei's grip on the girls intensifies through therapy sessions known as spiritual accompaniment, the rules escalate into mortification rituals or penances, with the women whipping themselves, taking ice-cold showers, and wearing spiky garters, as well as also, I don't know if it mentions this later, but sleeping on boards instead of on a mattress or on the floor. because apparently women are just so sensuous that they have to like basically be abused in order to like be kept in line, which is just one example of Jose Maria Escriva's misogyny. Eventually, they are encouraged to abandon career aspirations and dedicate themselves to a vocation centered around the sect. For women, the options are limited to caring for male contemporaries or raising a family. Quote, I worked for 2 years after I graduated to get experience of the real world, Aaron said. Now I'm grateful that I have seen the world so I can help more people. And I think that that is a really interesting thing to say, because Opus Dei likes to present itself as an organization of people that are living in the world, right? The whole idea is supposed to be that your work and your career and your family are your vocation, and you live out this vocation while being in the world. So it's a little strange to me that an Opus Dei member would need to go into the real world to get experience of the real world and to then come back to Opus Dei. Because based on the things that Opus Dei has said, the real world should be like alive and well in Opus Dei, should it not? Because people are living their vocation in the real world. No? But I think in reality, and again, I think this is a self-tell, we know that isn't true. And even the members themselves know that that isn't true, that what they are existing in within these Opus Dei centers, living this Opus Dei life, is not in any way reflective or emblematic of society as a whole. It's something that's very, very different and very, very counter. And Opus Dei has wasted a lot of paper trying to drive that like fact home and to convince everyone that it is this organization in the world, real people with real lives in the real world. But the reality is quite a bit different. Dogged by high-profile allegations internationally, Opus Dei has also had a troubled recent relationship with the Vatican. The late Pope Francis scrapped its privileged status in 2023 following claims of abuse in Chile and reduced its control over Basilica headquarters in Aragon. Now, how Pope Leo chooses to address the sect remains unanswered, and any form of regulation in the UK seems far from becoming a reality. And then here is a picture of Tina Fogarty, who was recruited at 16 years old to a boys' residence in Ireland to be an assistant numerary, to be a slave, a servant for this organization. And she has spent so much time and energy speaking out and seeking justice and attempting to hold this organization responsible for the things that it's done. She is amazing. Opus Dei is notoriously secretive and hard to infiltrate. Recently, multiple women from Argentina and Ireland claimed they were exploited as children by the religious offshoot and made to become domestic slaves for elite male members between 1972 and 2015. During their testimonies, they accused the organization of promising their poor families it would provide the girls with an education, but instead made them work grueling 12-hour days with no pay inside Opus Dei centers. Tina Fogarty, who grew up in Ballyrome, a small village in Laos, Ireland, was recruited at just 16 years old in a boys' residence in Ireland, cooking and cleaning for at times up to 150 people. Growing up in poverty and with strict Irish Catholic parents, she was offered a place on a 2-year catering course with the promise of a job afterwards. However, decades later, when she finally escaped their grasp, she had no qualifications and barely any money. She told the Daily Mail, quote, it was a repeated indoctrination, and a lot of the time it was done through fun, and then they make a big thing about being a part of the family. But it's this continuous coercion that doesn't appear to be dangerous on the surface, but it is. Founded in 1928 by a Spanish Roman Catholic priest called Jose Maria Escriva, Opus Dei aimed to promote holiness in ordinary life. There again, saying the whole living in the world, the holiness in ordinary life. You shouldn't need to go out into the world as a member of Opus Dei to be a member of Opus Dei. You should just already be there, using their own logic. The sect has since been established in 66 countries and has around 90,000 members who, in accordance with Escriva's teachings, must commit to a life of intense work, prayer, and asceticism. It acts as an institution within the Catholic Church, offering theologically conservative spiritual guidance to its members. Opus Dei literally translates to the work of God because it aims it to focus on the idea that members can find holiness through mundane everyday life. In the UK, there are centres in London, Manchester, Oxford, and Glasgow where celibate members either live or work. But joining Opus Dei is not easy. The 6-year process begins with a letter of admission to the prelate in Rome. This is followed by a ceremony 6 months later called the admission. A year later, the oblation occurs, where members formally commit themselves, which is renewed yearly on March 19th. After 6.5 years, the recruit will then take part in the Fidelity, a small ceremony where they dedicate themselves to a vocation and Opus Dei for the rest of their lives. The organization is known to provide spiritual direction to school children through youth clubs via charities set up by members. And allegedly, these charities are just the totally independent ventures of these members and are completely unaffiliated in any way with Opus Dei, but unsurprisingly, probably I don't believe them when they say that. As of 1982, when it received Vatican-approved status, anyone under the age of 18 was banned from formally joining. However, children aged 14 and a half can still become junior candidates if they write a letter to the head of the sect requesting admission, a process referred to as whistling. And I think anytime anyone writes a letter requesting admission, it is called whistling. But the reality of this junior candidates category is a fact, and something that it is really important to keep in mind whenever Opus Dei doubles down on statements that it does not target anyone under the age of 18 for recruitment. Because I think that it is backwards for you to say something like that, and then for you to turn around and talk about how you have this junior candidate category that children 14 and a half years of age and maybe even younger are able to apply for. Well, then what happens? Then they start getting all of the prerequisite Opus Dei talking points delivered into their ears. And wouldn't it stand to reason that that's where the grooming starts, so that by the time they reach the age of 18, they're ready to kick right over to a vocation that they've already been convinced that they have? It would seem that way to me. And I don't think that an organization that has been accused of the kinds of things that Opus Dei has been accused of has any business interacting with anyone under the age of 18 in any way, shape, or form. That is just my opinion, but I hold it very firmly. I think this organization is toxic, particularly to children, and that children should have absolutely nothing to do with it. And I think that putting a child in an Opus Dei environment, honestly, I think it could be viewed as spiritual and mental abuse, frankly. Here's a picture from inside the Ashwell house of a student praying. There's no mention of Opus Dei in the video that they say there. And then this is a clip from this same promotional video, which shows students being given an opportunity to mentor young girls. Children aged 14 and a half can still become junior candidates if they write a letter to the head of the sect requesting admission. This is for the Bay Tree Center, mentoring young girls. This is one afternoon per week for 1 hour. Contact this person here at this number. And they got tabs to pulled, and all but 2 of them have been pulled off, which means that there are kids going to be showing up at this Opus Dei center. And then this is the pristine entrance and Lakefield, where women spend their days cooking and cleaning. And I can tell you the reason it is pristine is because the women who are cooking and cleaning there are the ones who are doing the cleaning. For 18-year-olds enrolling in university, there are 2 women-only Opus Dei affiliated accommodations, Ashwell House in London and Coniston Halls in Manchester. Discussing how students enroll there, Aaron said, because it is Ashwell, it starts with an A, so it comes quite early in the list of accommodation on university websites. Only the half of the people there went there on purpose. Again, what was I saying? People are not seeking this place out because they want to live in an Opus Dei house. They're seeking it out because they need somewhere to live while they're going to university. And Opus Dei is not being upfront about the fact that it's an Opus Dei house. So students are not discovering that fact until they've already signed a lease agreement to pay rent to live there, and have already paid a deposit, and have already made all of these decisions and things that are very difficult to walk back, especially when you're in the middle of a very busy academic school year. It's not a situation that sets these people up for success, frankly, in my opinion. The halls of residence are purposely ambiguous about their association with Opus Dei, with most students enrolling by chance. It mentions Opus Dei on their website sparingly, disclosing that it has a role in Ashwell House's pastoral care and that the family atmosphere is inspired by the sect's founder Escriva, claiming participating in Ashwell's Christian formation offered is optional. But is it actually optional? In a promotional video uploaded to YouTube 9 years ago, beaming students described the accommodation as a family away from family, failing to mention any connection to the cult-like organization. I think that's a problem. I think that at best, that is a lie of omission. The only hints that the accommodation has any sort of religious affiliation is one clip showing a girl praying and a gold-framed image of a priest propped in between a group of girls sipping tea on the sofa. Students praise the staff, who they have regular catch-ups with, and reveal they take part in community projects, which includes mentoring young girls. And why do you think they're mentoring the young girls? Is it because they care about the professional and personal success of these young people as they're moving into their adult life? Or is it because this organization is on a rampage for power and money and influence, and fresh blood is an integral part of keeping the whole charade afloat? Could it be? Quote, if you are a woman with ambitions open to the bigger questions in life, then Ashwell is the place where you will flourish, they claim, implying that if you're open to these bigger questions, there are going to be conversations being had about these bigger questions, but that doesn't also seem to be really happening either. Vulnerability and innocence are textbook qualities that Opus Dei look for in new recruits, Tina explained. If you're a young woman, maybe away from home for the first time, there's already a vulnerability there, Tina said. Everything is new. Your studies are new, you're getting to know a peer group, trying to fit in, and then you have this residence that appears to be super friendly and supportive. You're targeted. It seems okay on the surface, but there begins the process of grooming, and it's relentless. They don't give up. Girls living in the discounted halls are charged £242 a week in central London, a bargain compared to nearby Unite halls, which charge £460 a week, excluding meals, cleaning services, and facilities. So there's an incentive for people to choose these houses. And the incentive is not, I want to be in a Catholic environment, I want to be in an Opus Dei environment. The incentive is the fact that it's cheaper, which means you're going to be getting a kind of person in there who is sort of vulnerable. Are they not? Someone who's in a vulnerable financial situation, who needs to live somewhere like this because they can't maybe afford to live somewhere else where the rent is so much higher. I think that induces a kind of forced vulnerability, right from the outset, which is really feels unsavory and gross to me. It is advertised on social media as a home away from home and has its own Instagram account where it shares curated group pictures of neat university students giggling over brunch and gingerbread houses. I also think that Opus Dei's very reductive perspective on people, and specifically on women, is very evident in all of this as well. I mean, if the female only servant class of Opus Dei wasn't evidence enough, there's also a lot of former members have talked about how they were encouraged, former female members specifically here, I'm saying, were encouraged to be have an innocent sort of childlike demeanor, to be very girly and kind of silly, and to be sort of spineless and fearful of the world, and just a wilting violet, in every sense of the word, because apparently that was the idea that Escriva had of women in his own mind, because again, he's the fount from which all of this poison flows. This organization's structure and charism and everything were curated, curated by Escriva, and have been kept in place by subsequent prelates, or whatever they're being called now. I guess they've lost their prelate title, but the heads of Opus Dei have maintained that same in perspective and environment, and that is evidenced through the testimonies that former female members give about being discouraged from thinking critically and really engaging with complex, nuanced subjects. Discussions about politics, maybe weren't necessarily encouraged. And they talk about in this video that's promoting, or on their social media, where they promote this home away from home with no mention of Opus Dei. It's all about having these, neat university students who are giggling over brunch and gingerbread houses. Because in Opus Dei's mind, I think there's a caricature of a person, this like archetypal, there are these archetypal caricatures of how people are supposed to behave and act, and it's applied to men as well. Men are victims of Opus Dei's misogyny the exact same way that women are. It impacts and manifests in different ways, and we're talking about a women's house here, so that is why I'm speaking from like a woman's perspective. But don't think for one moment that I think that men are like totally unaffected by this environment, by being treated as like these boys who need to be cleaned up and picked up after by these women who they can't even talk to. Like, it's not a positive environment for them either. It's negative for men as well. Men have negative consequences and negative outcomes from their exposure and experiences with the organization too. Misogyny affects us all. That's the takeaway here. But I'm not surprised that, rather than focusing on the fact that it's a Catholic affiliated house that is affiliated with a very specific organization, they would prefer to just focus on the airy curbside appeal, which is just giggling and gingerbread houses. And it feels very reductive and insulting too. These women are young women who are pursuing higher education. So they're not, you could, conclude they're not silly or simple-minded people. They're people who want to ask the big questions and dig into the real answers. And sad to say, but I'm not getting the impression of a domestic environment that would encourage that in any way, shape, or form. Here are some more pictures of the outside of Ashwell House, and then the living room at Ashwell House. I mean, it's very lovely, right? It's beautifully curated, modern furniture. Their cable management there of the TV is kind of out of control, but maybe that's an American thing. I don't know. It's a nice place, and you can see why people would be attracted to it, especially because it is so much cheaper than the other options in the area. But look, like, there's not a single religious photo anywhere like in here whatsoever. Nothing to alert you to the fact that this is a facility owned and operated by a very conservative Catholic organization. When our reporter visited Ashwell House, posing as a prospective student, a female member of staff called a domestic services manager explained that the price included 2 hot meals a day and laundry is done for the students by workers. Students living in Ashwell are promised a new family in a city where they know no one and are given small roles tying themselves to the group, including brunch committee. She said, "We all do everything, and every girl has a job in the house. We eat together. You don't dribble in and dribble out. You come, sit down, talk to one another. No set places, and as people begin to group together, we split you up so that everyone gets to know everyone. That means you have a big group of people who become friends." So on the surface of it, that sounds really, really nice. And I don't necessarily think that, like, again, on the surface of it, that's an indication of anything nefarious, but because we are so aware of the organization at question here, which is Opus Dei, and all of the problematic issues under that umbrella, I think it is interesting that the students who end up living here are expected to toe the line almost immediately out the gate. And on the face of it, that sounds nice and everything. But because of the organization that we're talking about here, it's really hard not to feel like there's something a little bit devious going on there. And also, it sounds very nice to sit down and have like family meals and everything like that. But what is that like family environment actually like? I mean, there's so much talk about this being a new family and everything, but what is that family environment actually like? I mean, because if it's completely toxic and untenable, then what's the upside there? There's absolutely no upside. Says that as their dedication towards the family intensifies, so do the religious expectations. And this is exactly what I am talking about. On the face of it, it seems fine to have like this student residence where things are structured to save costs, and one of the ways that costs are saved is by having students chip in to help with like the upkeep of the place. On the face of it, I don't necessarily think that that's a bad idea, because I think you can, incorporate some kind of cool life lessons and life skills and things in there if that's done properly. But again, my impression of this and of the like Opus Dei student residence model in general is not an impression of a residence that is intended to like give students this all-encompassing like university experience that's going to really set them up for success, as much as it is, like I said, about creating this conduit, this pipeline, where you now have a pool of people to recruit from. And the reason why I feel like that is probably the case is because, you know, they said earlier that participating in like the religious or spiritual formation was supposed to be optional for people living at this house, who, you know, are not all going to be Catholic, because people are not choosing this because they know what it is. They're choosing it because it's a cheaper place to live. So then there's this expectation, the longer that you're there, that, oh, well, if you're going to help with this, well, maybe you can help with this thing too. And, oh, well, you know, a bunch of us are getting together on Thursday for our weekly circle, and you know, you should really come to that. If you're going to really succeed here and have like a successful educational career, we really think that you should be coming to these. And there's all this pressure that starts to be built. This intensifying religious expectation. Daily Mass, bearing their souls to the numeraries that work there, and learning how to clean priests' garments become as integrated into their lifestyle as Saturday night pajama parties. The religion centers around rigid hierarchical structures, which sees males and females as living separate celibate lives unless they are married, in which case they must focus on the sanctification of their family duties. Tina explained that Opus Dei pre-assign the category of each new recruit falls into, steering them into a specific direction accordingly. It's the needs of the organization. Whatever they need, they're going to plug you in where they need you at, which is why nobody ever independently discerns that they have a vocation to this organization. They're always told that they have a vocation by someone who's already in the organization. And it's never a vocation of their own choosing. It's, oh, we see that you have a vocation to be an assistant numerary, and you have to obey this vocation because it's coming from God. And if you don't obey this vocation, then you and your family will suffer tremendously for it. Tina explained, okay, yeah, pre-assigned the category that new recruits fall into. Speaking from a quiet town in Spain, where she moved to after escaping the sect, Tina said, as soon as they interact with you, you have a label over your head. They make this big kind of a sort of a thing about making you feel like, oh, you're a part of the family now, you're in the know. You feel a little bit a part of the club, so they kind of closed ranks around me and separated me a little bit from everybody else. They were also telling me that they thought that I should be an assistant numerary. Tina was told by a senior member of Opus Dei, anyone can get married and have kids. That's not terribly noble. Which sounds like it was said by someone who is not married and does not have their own children. Because I think anybody who's actually done that would be able to tell you how incredibly challenging it is to be married and have children and raise a family. Like, one of the hardest things a person can ever do. So anyone who's ever done that would never say that it's like not a terribly noble thing to do, because it's difficult to have a family and to raise a family well, and to raise a family well is very noble. But you wouldn't know that if you took a vow of celibacy when you were 14 and a half years old and were never allowed to have any life experiences and were only fed information that was in line with your dogmatic and fanatical groupthink. Aaron told our reporter that Opus Dei is split into regions. The UK is grouped with Sweden, Ireland, and the Netherlands. Each region is dictated by a group of 9 men or women, depending on gender, called the advisory. They control where each member lives and works. Education and power is essential for members of the advisory, who will typically have PhDs, while married members, known as supernumeraries, are expected to have high-power jobs with large earning potential to donate to the organization. As the hierarchy trickles down, so do the educational expectations of each member. Priests and numeraries must have a degree, while assistant numeraries can remain uneducated. So there's quite a bit of disparity there between the options that are available to these different groups of people. And it's not a disparity that's being chosen freely by those people. It's a predetermined structural feature. Both men and women can become numeraries, while the male numeraries use their time to pursue the studies required for priesthood. Tina escaped nearly 30 years ago after enduring years of emotional trauma from the age of just 16, and even brought civil claims against the sect for personal injury in the UK and Ireland. She has since created a life for herself in Spain, where she lives with her partner and dog, and is even considering enrolling in university to gain the degree and education Opus Dei deprived her of. Reflecting on her time in the sect as a teen, Tina warned, "When your spirit is broken and your health is not good, you kind of don't know how to resist or fight." A spokesman for Opus Dei said, "Opus Dei deny these allegations or as false or taken out of context, and are open for the Daily Mail to speak directly to residents in Lakefield or Ashwell House to verify the truth of the matter." Totally unsurprising statement from them. So this article was really, really interesting. Somebody went undercover for however long to gain all of this information and insight, which is just absolutely fascinating. Shout out to Jordana Seal for doing that, and shout out to Tina Fogarty for being a part of this investigation, for lending her perspective and insight as a former assistant numerary member of Opus Dei. And yeah, all love and support to all of the victim survivors who have been working so hard, speaking out, people like Tina and Anne Marie and so many other people all around the world, because this is not landlocked to a specific region. And as someone who has become something of a lifelong student herself, I am a big believer in access to information and in public education and everything. And getting an education does so many things for you beyond just like the immediate obvious, like giving you a certification or something like that, because it molds your mind and your person into someone who can better articulate themselves, better convey ideas, complex ideas, and also just opens your mind to the world. So to anyone listening, if you've been on the fence, if you're thinking about going back to school, you've been on the fence about it, I hope that you will take this as the encouragement to do so, because I'm a believer in it, and it's a powerful thing, education, when you can get access to it. All right, so making our way along, we are getting close to the end here. Thank you for sitting with me for this. Like I said, this is long, like I told you that it would be, but so many interesting articles this week, so please let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. This is from a Polish site, and the headline says, "This 97-year-old church organization covers up scandals the old-fashioned way. The beatification process for the founder of Opus Dei proceeded at lightning speed, despite priests claiming that Escriva ran the organization as if leading a mafia dressed in white." And this was apparently written by Gareth Gore. Shout out Gareth Gore. And published on, is there a date somewhere on here? Yes, the 7th of March. So let's read through this. I thought that this would be a really good article. It's come out very recently, so it fits my top of the month category. And it's about a particularly contentious and controversial facet of Opus Dei, which is the fact that its founder was rushed to sainthood in the Catholic Church at a rate that was a bit unprecedented, and allegedly disregarding the testimony and insights of people who knew the founder but did not have complimentary things to say about him. So there was some selective data acquisition during the investigation to determine whether or not Escriva should be canonized a saint. And he was canonized a saint in the 80s. And there are a lot of reasons why people take issue with this canonization process right here. And I wanted to read it and talk about it a little bit, particularly because I had someone in the comments on another video saying that they informed me that the Catholic Church's canonization process is the most secure in the universe. That's right, not even the aliens have a canonization process as secure as the Catholic Church is. And so therefore, it is impossible for the Catholic Church to make any sort of error in canonizing a person. And well, to that person, I must say I disagree. And this article right here lays out a good case example for why that is. So, Gareth Gore wrote, in May 1992, Opus Dei members from around the world gathered in Rome for a supposedly historic event, the beatification of their movement's founder and Heavenly Father, Jose Maria Escrivá. In the days leading up to the ceremony, Fiumicino Airport, sorry about that, welcomed hordes of pilgrims arriving on more than 100 flights chartered by the prelature. Those who couldn't find a seat on the planes were brought in by bus from all over Europe. Because crowds were expected, the coffin containing the remains of the founder of Opus Dei was moved from the crypt in Villa Tavere to the Basilica of St. Eugene, a modern church located just a kilometer away so that more people could pay their respects. The delicate operation was overseen by the Roman police, as reports had surfaced that Basque separatists from ETA might attempt to steal the coffin. Ultimately, no such attempt occurred, but the threat itself reminded everyone of Opus Dei's dark past, particularly its collaboration with Franco's regime and doubts about the legality of the assets accumulated during the dictatorship. The pilgrims arriving in Rome were not concerned with any of these issues. They dutifully filed past the coffin, which was displayed before an altar on a catafalque draped in red cloth and adorned with roses. On the day of the ceremony, 200,000 people gathered in St. Peter's Square. John Paul II was to celebrate an outdoor mass there. Not all of the faithful were affiliated with Opus Dei. In addition to the tourists who always flocked to the site, the organization also attracted thousands of students. Their trip to Rome was subsidized for this purpose. Louis Valls Taberner, along with other distinguished guests, watched the ceremony from chairs placed on the steps of the basilica. Those in the front row had the Pope almost within arm's reach. While the banker was viewed with suspicion in Madrid's political circles due to numerous corruption allegations, the prominent seat he received that day clearly demonstrated the high status of the Banco Popular president among Opus Dei members. And if you have read or are at all familiar with the story as it goes in Gareth Gore's book Opus, then you will be familiar with Louis Valls Taberner and his infamous history in relation to Opus Dei. Not far away sat Santiago Escrivá, the only sibling of the founder of Opus Dei. Among the honored guests was Giulio Andreotti, a lifelong senator and 7-time prime minister of Italy, for whom the ceremony in St. Peter's Square was more important than participating in the parliamentary vote to elect the next president. Dozens of countries where Opus Dei was active sent delegates. Nevertheless, dissatisfaction was growing among the Vatican elite over the failure of the Church's conservative line to capture the public's imagination. Quote, "Why is the press so favorable to Mother Teresa, but she has so little to say about Opus Dei or me?" End quote, the Pope asked as he received Del Portillo in a private audience, which is a very interesting thing to say. And I also will add that Mother Teresa herself does not have a particularly good history. If you actually dig into the real goings on with her and her religious order and the environment that was apparently inculcated inside this order, for all that she was allegedly in India to help the poor, it was not a good situation for a lot of the people in this religious order. And there's a podcast out there, like an investigative series all about it. And I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but I'm sure if you Google Mother Teresa, like podcast or something like that, it would come up. And I have it linked on my website, actually. If you scroll over to the tab for like resources and information, I have the podcast linked over on my website, along with some other resources and things about high control religious groups and Opus Dei and everything else. The accuracy of JP2's observation was demonstrated by the furor that erupted in the press over the decision to beatify Escrivá. It sparked intense controversy, both inside and outside the Vatican. Opus Dei initiated the process well before the standard 5-year period expired. It hired a special team to compile all the documentation and compile a list of potential miracles. Subsequent stages were carried out with unprecedented speed. Less than 17 years passed from Escrivá's death to his beatification, a third of the usual time. Controversy also arose over an alleged miracle attributed to the Blessed. It concerned a Carmelite nun who returned to life just a year after Escrivá's death. As it turned out, she was the cousin of Mariano Navarro Rubia, one of the most prominent members of Opus Dei and a minister in Franco's government. A doctor was also a member of the movement, and he confirmed that the event could not be explained as anything other than a miracle. So this is all feeling like a very internal type of investigation with internal self-fulfilling outcomes. The organization took preventative measures to discredit anyone who might oppose the beatification. This included Antonio Perez Tenenza. Perez Tenenza was a priest and head of the Spanish region. He escaped in the middle of the night and was later traced to Mexico. Some former Opus Dei members tried to protest at the Vatican but were refused a hearing. Father Vladimir Felsman, a former Opus Dei priest who worked alongside Escrivá in Rome in the 1960s, gave an interview to Newsweek in which he surmised that the Opus Dei founder was afraid of human sexuality, believed everything he wrote came from God, had difficulty controlling his anger, and, most damningly, defended Adolf Hitler. Quote, "You know what, Vlad? Hitler couldn't have been as terrible as people say," Escrivá reportedly told him. "He couldn't have killed 6 million Jews. There couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 million. Yikes. There was considerable talk in the Vatican about the damage to public image that could be caused by artificially accelerating the beatification of such a controversial figure. The rapid pace of the process, along with the selective selection of evidence and the silencing of critics, proved, in the opinion of many, that the beatification had simply been bought. The discomfort of church representatives was evidenced by the fact that 2 of the 9 members of the Vatican Council considering the motion voted against, demanding additional time to examine the less glorious pages of Escrivá's life, such as those related to the ongoing conflict with the Jesuits, as well as the occasionally raised issue of his lack of humility and doubts related to the miracles attributed to him. One Spanish priest was particularly scathing, saying, quote, "It is impossible to consider someone who served the state and then the power he thus acquired to carry out his work as a model of Christian life, which he then ran according to questionable principles, as if leading a mafia dressed in white." And further, the beatification of Father means the sanctification of his work with all its negative aspects, such as tactics, dogmas, and recruitment methods, which result in placing Christ in the midst of politics and economics. And it feels as if that has been a self-fulfilling prophecy right there. Self-fulfilling statement. However, even with such fierce opposition, the application was ultimately approved. It didn't matter what people said. Escrivá was still declared a saint. And I'm just scrolling through here to get the last little bit here. So speaking about this Navarro Valls character specifically, and there's more, like I said, about him in Gareth Gore's book Opus, he occasionally abused his position in the interests of Opus Dei, and I'm sure he's not the only one. He once invited members of the Vatican press corps to his home, ostensibly to present them with important information about the Pope. Instead, the journalists were shown an Opus Dei recruitment video. As the Pope's health deteriorated, rumors began to spread that Navarro Valls might begin to exert excessive influence on Vatican decision-making. John Paul II, however, continued to assert his authority over any factions within the Church he deemed subversive, and Opus Dei was a key ally in this endeavor. These relationships benefited both sides. Opus Dei could present itself to potential recruits as a key force in the papal Counter-Reformation initiative, while the Vatican had a loyal ally ready to counterbalance reluctant priests on the ground. As a reward for this support, Del Portillo became a bishop. This joined the ranks of 10 Opus Dei clergy whom John Paul II had elevated to this rank since his election. Ultimately, 21 Opus Dei priests received their mitres from him. By comparison, Paul VI elevated only 3 representatives of the organization to the rank of bishop. This promotion and the strengthening position of Opus Dei in the Church gave Del Portillo a new boost of energy to strengthen the movement in the most powerful country in the world. So, if you have not read Opus, please do. It has this kind of information and more besides. It's an incredibly educational book. And if you want to read this article in more detail, you can find it linked down below. But sound off for me in the, about to say in the chat, this isn't live, in the comments section, whether or not you think that that the Catholic Church's canonization process is the most secure in the universe. The way that one commenter told me that it most definitely is. Because I don't believe it. I don't believe it for 1 second. All right, moving on. This is the third from the end. And this is a story that has some layers to it. This is a situation that has some nuance. And based on the way that this article ends, it honestly makes me feel sick to my stomach on behalf of this woman who is now deceased. So this was published from a Latin news site. It was published on November 11th, 2025. And the reason why I am bringing this up is because of what we are going to read in a minute from this article that was written by Gareth Gore for the National Catholic Reporter about his meeting with Pope Leo, which happened last month and was obviously a huge deal, and is the reason why Gareth Gore's name has been popping up quite a bit more in the recent weeks. But he talks about something in this article, something that he talked to Pope Leo about, actually a couple of things. And even though this article is not from last month, it discusses something that is very current. And I wanted to bring it to your attention because I do not think that this situation is, unfortunately, rare in Opus Dei or just really in society as a whole. It says a $30 million investment by an Opus Dei family that ended in scandal. The story centers on a woman with psychiatric problems who spent decades in a clinic in Montevideo. Since March this year, the Third Shift Economic Crime Prosecutor's Office, headed by Gilberto Rodriguez, has been investigating a case that resulted, among other things, in the closure of the Uruguayan stock exchange group Sociedad de Bolsa S.A. following an order from the Central Bank of Uruguay, BCU. The story centers on a childless woman, a member of Opus Dei, one of the most orthodox branches of the Catholic Church. The deceased, who had been declared legally incompetent, left an inheritance of $90 million derived from her mining activities in Chile. Maria Luisa Giannoli was declared legally incapacitated in 2010 and died in 2014. Her sister Elena, who had assumed guardianship after the onset of her illness, died in 2022. Jose Luis Zabaleta, an expert from the Forensic Technical Institute, then assumed Giannoli's guardianship. According to the prosecutor's investigation, Zabaleta made an agreement with Alvaro Correa, head of the brokerage firm, through which $30 million of that original $90 million lump sum was invested. Zabaleta's lawyers, Martin Perez Branchero and Leonardo Guzman, maintain that Correa assured their client it was a safe, low-risk investment. The agreed-upon term was 18 months, and the chosen product was Forastera, whose assets are linked to Forestal Uruguay Limited. The BCU, as initially reported by El Observador, detected that the ultimate beneficiary of those assets was the son of Alvaro Correa, who was also part of the stock brokerage firm's staff. So they had a little bit of a circular situation going on here. The funds were not ending up in the place that they were supposed to end up. Or at least they ended up in exactly the place that they were supposed to end up. But that place is not the place that was being publicly disclosed initially. Zabaleta is stated that his role was to manage the money, but that he did not assume responsibility for investment decisions. He indicated that he trusted Correa regarding the product's safety and that, with the approval of other technicians linked to the family, he gave the green light to the transaction. The complaint filed by the Central Bank of Uruguay, BCU, placed Zabaleta within a causal chain, Guzman explained to Montevideo Portal. The case points to him that there is no direct accusation. We have evidence to assert that those $30 million was not lost due to a premeditated action by Zabaleta, he stated. The multi-million-dollar sum was intended to preserve Giannoli's inheritance, which is why various investments were made in different sectors. Most of these investments yielded positive results, but problems began when they started trading with Correa's brokerage firm. For the time being, the prosecutor's office is investigating several people, including Zabaleta, although the investigation has not progressed. Perez Branchero and Guzman are waiting for their client to be called to testify. Quote, he is experiencing an uncomfortable situation being under the investigation. We understand that the prosecutor, Rodriguez, has several important cases, but it is necessary to move forward as soon as possible, said one of the lawyers. And so these final two paragraphs are the part that really made my blood run cold, because they write that the deceased woman, Maria Luisa Giannoli, was around 90 years old at the time of her death, but had been hospitalized multiple times for psychiatric conditions whatever those are, and she spent at least a decade in a Montevideo clinic after being diagnosed with cognitive impairment. Her health was particularly affected by various antipsychotics received in her youth and by electroshock sessions applied to treat a suspected early onset schizophrenia. So, the reason why I do not think that this is simply the case of someone with a lot of money who was under a guardianship, having those funds basically stolen from them post-mortem, which is already complicated enough on its own. But I think that there is another element within this case, and that is the Opus Dei element. And it's an element that has presented in ways that I and Gareth Gore and numerous former members have all talked about ad nauseum, which is the fact that for a Catholic organization that is supposed to be so like in the world and whatnot, there seem to be a number of people. It seems to function, it's been said, as a nursery for vulnerable adults. And while there are people in all religions, religion can tend to attract people who are like mentally unstable, there's a high percentage of those people in Opus Dei. And those people talk about being medicated while they were in Opus Dei, being forced to take antipsychotics because the environment that they're in started to have such a negative impact on them that it was affecting their mental and physical health. And so the Opus Dei way to deal with that inevitability is through medication, is through using psychiatric medicine as a Band-Aid patch on a sucking chest wound. And there are so many stories about people who were on the receiving end of these kinds of treatments. They're on Opus Libris, they're on Opus Dei Exposed, they're in news articles like this one and the one that I'm about to read you here coming up. And even I have done at least one, if not more, pieces talking specifically about the issue of the abuse of psychiatric medicine within Opus Dei, which I believe is a feature more than it is a bug. And so I feel sick to my stomach when I read about someone who apparently lived her life, or a good part of the last of her life, in a hospital for undisclosed psychiatric conditions. And oftentimes for a lot of these people in Opus Dei who end up in these situations, the psychiatric condition appears to be Opus Dei itself. But the organization is unable to look itself in the eye. And so this is the result. People are sent away. They're given pills to just take and told to just deal with whatever it is that they're dealing with. And it does not make me feel good to hear about someone who had been hospitalized multiple times, someone who is an Opus Dei member, hospitalized multiple times for undisclosed psychiatric conditions, that she spent a decade in this Montevideo clinic, that she was under a guardianship that her sister had, and that her health was particularly affected not by like something that she was born with or some sort of traumatic event in her life. No, by various antipsychotics received in her youth and by electroshock sessions applied to treat a suspected early onset schizophrenia. Electroshock sessions and being required to take antipsychotics are features and not bugs of too many former members' stories. So it's really, really hard for me to read this as anything other than a situation in which Opus Dei was doing what Opus Dei does, and they made a mistake and got caught. And this poor woman, Elena Giannoli, who is, this is her sister. This is the sister. So wait, yeah, it says Elena Giannoli, who was her sister's curator. So the woman, Maria Luisa Giannoli, isn't even pictured here. The woman on the front here was her conservator, her sister. And if you know anything at all about the landscape of the conservator guardianship sphere, which is a bizarre feature of our legal system, and I fail to see how it isn't just like legalized slavery, essentially. But if you know anything about guardianships, conservatorships, then you know that it is very, very easy for people to take advantage of the individual who is in that guardianship, to take advantage of their funds and their finances and their social clout and their fame. The most obvious public example is Britney Spears, who was in a very public conservatorship for years and may still be today, depending on who you ask. It's like barely legalized slavery. And in Opus Dei, there's this added element of the electroshock therapy and antipsychotics, which, like I said, are a feature and not a bug. So keep this story in the back of your mind, along with the idea that, like, this is probably not the only one. This is just the one that we know about. And I'm going to read you Gareth Gore's article that he published for the National Catholic Reporter, had him write this for them. This is under the opinion guest voices category, which I think is kind of funny. But it says, Gareth Gore, what I told Pope Leo about my research into Opus Dei. And let's just read what he had to say, shall we? This was published March 17th. I was in Silicon Valley for a work trip a few years ago when a curious message flashed up on my phone. Podrías contactarme? Es importante. It's read. Can you get in touch? It's important. The message was from Pedro Salinas, a fellow journalist from Peru whose excellent work had helped to bring about the suppression of an abusive Catholic group there, the SAV, and who I had gotten to know through my own work exposing the abuses of Opus Dei. We had last spoken in early December when we both appeared at a conference in Argentina, and so my first instinct on seeing the message was to assume the worst. Opus Dei is threatening to sue, I thought. Again! I called him from a parking lot across the street from the futuristic Googleplex campus in Mountain View, where I had just been to meet with a contact. Pedro had come to know Pope Leo, known as Cardinal Robert Prevost back then, through his work detailing widespread abuse inside the sodality of Christian life, and the two remained in touch. Pedro explained to me that the Pope was well aware of my own work on Opus Dei, and that he was keen to speak with me in a private audience, just the two of us. Would I be open to meeting him? I took a minute to compose myself before replying, yes, of course I would. Over the next few days, I exchanged WhatsApp messages with an intermediary at the Vatican who had been asked to arrange the meeting. Then the lines of communication went mysteriously quiet. Had someone inside the Holy See scuppered the meeting, I wondered? Was my audience with the Pope being postponed indefinitely? After reporting on Opus Dei for the past 7 years, I know all too well about the group's influence inside the Vatican. Thankfully, my suspicions proved misplaced. 2 weeks later, confirmation arrived in the form of an ornate invitation from the prelature of the papal household. On the morning of March 16th, I presented myself to the Swiss guards outside the main entrance to the Apostolic Palace and showed them my invitation and passport. I had flown in from my home in London the previous evening. They ushered me into the Pontifical Palace and into a wood-paneled elevator. After that, I was taken through various ornate rooms to a first waiting area and then to a second, where I was told to leave my phone. After a short while, I was taken into the private library, where the Pope posed for pictures with me and congratulated me on my book, which he called a rigorous piece of work. We then sat down and began our conversation. Here's a picture. Here's Gareth. He's holding his book. There's the Pope with a look of, I don't know what that facial expression could be described as. I'm not really sure, but they're having their meeting. Anyone who has read my Substack before will know how critical I've been about the way that the Catholic Church has handled, or more accurately, mishandled, decades of abuse allegations made against Opus Dei. The group has been accused of a long list of misdeeds, of grooming children, of trafficking and enslaving young girls, and drugging members to hide the mental health epidemic within its ranks. It also was accused of breaking the seal of the confessional and using spiritual guidance sessions to collect information about its members so that it can manipulate them into serving its own interests. There are literally hundreds of testimonies from victims online on websites such as opuslibros.org and Reddit. Shout out Opus Dei Exposed. I have been outspoken about the Church's complete failure to address these very serious abuses. While Pope Francis raised hopes among victims when he issued a surprise motu proprio in July 2022, ordering Opus Dei to rewrite its statutes, And the years that have passed since it began to look increasingly like reform of the group was little more than a public relations exercise. The Vatican never once reached out to former members to understand what it was that needed reforming. In fact, it completely ignored approaches from people who offered to help with information and documents smuggled out of the organization. My conclusion was that the Vatican didn't want to know the truth. I suspected that it was worried that a full investigation into Opus Dei might be hugely embarrassing for the Church. I deduced that it was content with just making a few superficial changes and moving on without properly understanding or tackling the problem. But my meeting with the Pope forces me to reassess these conclusions. It is, of course, possible that Leo invited me to meet him to make it look like he was hearing from all parties after meeting with the leader of Opus Dei twice in the past year. But it is also possible that he actually wants to do the right thing, that he wants to hear the truth. I'm not going to go into detail about what the Pope told me or what questions he asked. I will leave it to the Vatican to decide what it wants to say about the meeting. But I am very happy to say what I said in the meeting and what information I provided to him. I believe such transparency is important. Not only does it offer hope to Opus Dei's many victims that these allegations are now being heard, but perhaps even more importantly, it creates a public record of what the Pope and wider Vatican are now aware of. By putting on record what information I shared with the Pope in the meeting, nobody can now turn around and say, well, we didn't know. And I already said earlier in this video why I think it's completely ridiculous for the Catholic Church to be claiming ignorance on any of this, but I digress. I spoke at length about what former members had told me about the way that Opus Dei operates, about how the group abuses the legitimacy conferred upon it by the Catholic Church to lure unsuspecting victims into its clutches. I detailed allegations about how the group actively targets young children, how it grooms and manipulates them into a lifelong commitment to serving its interests from the tender age of 10 or 11, without their parents ever being consulted. I shared testimonies and documents backing this up and offered to connect the Vatican with people who were involved in such grooming who will testify to these allegations. I also shared with the Pope documents and testimonies detailing how the group controls and manipulates the lives of its members and how it is accused of breaking the seal of confession and abusing spiritual guidance sessions to collect information about unsuspecting Catholics so that it can manipulate and take advantage of them. I talked about how Opus Dei abuses the faith of its members to contract money, favors, and obedience. I argued that the group should be considered an abusive cult that has zero regard for its victims or the wider church. I also shared disturbing firsthand accounts shared with me of, and this is where I would ask that you hearken back to the article that we just read a moment ago, of a psychiatric facility in the north of Spain known to those inside Opus Dei as La Cuarta Planta, the fourth floor, where members were quietly sent to be treated for the devastating impact that life inside the group has had on their mental well-being. I offered to connect the Vatican with people who had been treated there and former senior members of the organization who were pushed to send people to the facility. I also shared testimonies detailing the widespread use of prescription drugs to conceal mental illness and of members committing suicide. So this story from earlier out of Montevideo about Maria Luisa Giannoli is not some weird outlier. Like I said, it's a feature, not a bug. Naturally, I also spoke about the case in Argentina where Opus Dei has been formally accused of human trafficking, of luring vulnerable young girls into a life of servitude by offering them false promises of a good education and a better life, and then trafficking them around the world to work as unpaid servants. I personally handed the Pope a copy of the report written by Argentinian public prosecutors following a 2-year investigation into the group's practices. I also made it clear that this isn't a one-off, that similar allegations have surfaced in many other countries, including Ireland, France, Mexico, and Spain. I shared details of the network of hospitality schools set up across Latin America, Europe, Africa, and Asia accused of recruiting such girls. I also spoke about Opus Dei's efforts to cover up its abuses, of how it sought to threaten and intimidate me and my publisher into pulping my book, of how it launched a disinformation campaign to discredit and undermine me as a journalist, rather than answer for the allegations made against it. I detailed how this appeared to be the modus operandi of the group, how it previously used lawfare to intimidate whistleblowers and force websites to remove internal documents that could be considered damaging to its reputation, how the group had used its power and its wealth to cover up the truth and suppress the voices of many victims. I ended the meeting by imploring Leo to take action against this abusive group. I urged him to immediately launch an independent inquiry into Opus Dei abuses headed up by both clerical and lay experts, covering allegations of spiritual, psychological, emotional, physical, and financial abuse. I said that he should stand ready to close down the organization if the evidence merits it. I also urged him to reopen the beatification and canonization of the group's founder, Jose Maria Escrivá, because of information that has since emerged indicating potential irregularities in the process. I presented him with documents proving how Opus Dei's system of grooming, abuse, and control have been personally designed by this supposed saint. We ended the meeting on good terms and shook hands. As we parted, I urged the Pope to meet with victims for himself, to listen to their accounts and offer them some hope that justice might prevail. As I emerged out onto the street and headed to the airport for my flight back to London, my mind turned to them. So many people have had their lives ruined by this group. For years, they have felt that nobody was listening. But perhaps things are changing. One thing is certain. Leo's tenure will be marked in no small part by what he does next to address this abusive group. So I wanted to make sure that I read this because, again, this has been a major news development, and a lot of people have been talking about what it means that Pope Leo is meeting with a secular journalist who wrote what I think can be considered the most up-to-date and easily accessible historical account of Opus Dei, of this organization in the Catholic Church. And I've been very, very critical of the Catholic Church and of Pope Leo as well, for a myriad of different reasons under the umbrella of human rights and human dignity. So I'm not really willing to hand out an award for simply doing what should be pretty obvious, which is meeting with the people who are researching and working to understand the organization that is inside the religion that you are in charge of. I'm not really going to hand out an award for that, but I can acknowledge that I'm hopeful that it means that the Pope is going to do something of some sort, and what that is anyone's guess, of course, because nothing at all has happened yet. But like I had said earlier, because of the fact that this organization is a global organization, and I'm talking about the Catholic Church here, the Catholic Church is as much a governmental political entity as it is a religious organization. And so when they do things, when things are done publicly, it's reasonable to believe that it's done to send a message of some sort. And so what kind of message is the Vatican or Pope Leo sending by meeting with a secular journalist like Gareth Gore? I don't really know. Obviously, the hope is that it means that the Vatican and the Pope are very serious about addressing this issue, about addressing Opus Dei. But we won't know until something happens. And I said as much in my last deep dive video, which was the second and final part of my deep dive into the SCV organization. But until something substantial actually happens, until there is some sort of I've had it up to here with the symbology and the ceremony and the things that are done to make it look like something meaningful is happening, when in actuality on the ground nothing is changing in any way whatsoever. I'm hopeful that this means that there's a change in strategy occurring, but we simply will not know. And anyone can show up to a meeting, anyone can shake a journalist's hand, anyone can express their solidarity with journalists or victim survivors. But it's just statements. At the end of the day, it's just words coming out of somebody's mouth, and it doesn't actually indicate anything substantive until there is something substantive there. And so We will see what we will see with this, but I cannot think of a better person to have gone and met with Pope Leo to talk about Opus Dei, simply because his research has been so incredibly rigorous and his book is completely unassailable, clearly, or it never would have seen the light of day. Opus Dei would have made damn sure of that. But they couldn't do that. They couldn't keep it from getting out and from being published. And it's an unassailable book in that regard. And the information that it contains therein is damning. If even a fraction of the information contained therein is true, and a good part of it, a good bit of it is verifiably true, this organization is screwed. It's not good. It's not good. And so I think it is good that this meeting happened. But I hope that it translates into something substantive and meaningful. And until it does, my position towards the Vatican Church and towards Pope Leo is going to remain the same, which is that the bar is in hell, and I'm not going to hand out awards for doing the bare minimum. Because it takes no effort to go to a meeting and shake someone's hand. I want to see actual reform from the top down. And until that happens, my opinion and my perspective is not really going to change a whole lot on the Catholic Church, on Pope Leo, on Opus Dei, or on anything else. So last but not least, this is a good one to end on. Here's something you can go and listen to after, if you haven't filled your Opus Dei quota enough for the day listening to me read these articles, then there is a fantastic new podcast that's been put out by the Financial Times. It's an ongoing podcast, a new segment on their podcast, and it is called Opus Dei Inside a Controversial Catholic Group. And it's a new series that's examining how this small group within the Catholic Church has come to wield outsized cultural and political influence in America. And it is being spearheaded by Antonia Cundy, who's a journalist for the Financial Times, has written a couple of pieces in the past for the Financial Times about Opus Dei's behavior and activities in the UK. She's a fantastic journalist, and I've listened to, there's only 3 episodes out so far. I listened to all 3 or 4 of them, and it's a fantastic series, so please go and check it out. But I wanted to read you this little blurb about what the series is going to cover, and you should be able to find this on like any platform that you listen to any podcast on. I listen to it on Spotify, so if you listen on Spotify, you can find it there. But this says, 2 years ago, Financial Times journalist Antonia Cundy began investigating the controversial Catholic organization Opus Dei. The story she uncovered was not what she expected, because what started as an investigation into the impact Opus Dei had on individuals turned into an account about how it is changing a country, the U.S., and its culture. There, despite having only 3,000 members, Opus Dei has developed significant connections to power. In this series, Antonia hears from former members who joined Opus Dei to deepen their faith, but said they found unstated agendas and unexpected harm entangled in that spiritual mission. They share stories of opaque attempts to wield influence and a drive to expand that came at the expense of people's freedom. From small towns to Ivy League universities and Washington's corridors of power, Antonia unpicks the reality of this often sensationalized group and uncovers how its culture, practices, and worldview have led it to become a central pillar in an ascendant conservative movement. This series raises questions about intentions and their consequences. When does guidance become control? When does privacy become secrecy? When does spiritual belief become political ideology? Untold Opus Dei is a 4-part series released every Wednesday from March 25th. And like I said, I think it's just the first 3. Yeah, it's the first 3 episodes that are out now. You can find them on your podcasting platform of choice, and please do go and give them a listen. Every single episode is somewhere between like 20 to 30 minutes in length. It's a fully produced podcast with like sound effects and music, and just like, it's a very well done podcast, and the effort is evident, and that deserves some appreciation. So please go and listen to this if you have not started already, and show Antonia Cundy and the Financial Times some appreciation and support for their willingness to talk about these issues. So with that said, that brings us to the end of this analysis. The crazy thing is, I had already recorded this entire thing once already and posted it and uploaded it to like YouTube and everything, only to discover that there was like a major audio error in the footage that made it like really, really hard to listen to. There was a crazy echo, and I couldn't do that to you guys. I couldn't leave that up. So I pulled it down, sat down today, and re-recorded it all. So this is like the second time that I have done this. The information in this newsroom analysis is probably going to stick with me now more than any other analysis that I've ever done, just because some of this stuff is beginning to feel like it's committed to memory because I've been rereading it a couple of times here. But this is a segment that I believe in. I think it's important to take the time to see what is being said all around the world in regard to human rights and within religious communities too, because these issues don't stay landlocked to the little community in which they occur. Trauma doesn't work that way. Right? We know that trauma is like a rock dropped in the center of a very still lake, and it will send out ripple after ripple after ripple long after that stone has sank to the bottom of the lake. And trauma is very, very similar. It moves in a similar way. It impacts people in indirect but outsized ways. And I think it's important to have conversations about some of these groups that are contributing to, sorry to say, but not positive or good things in our society. And I always think it's interesting when I get folks in my comments section who are practicing Catholics who are upset and angry about the fact that I am talking about these issues, who view the fact that I am bringing these matters of public concern to like the public sphere. They view that as me like bashing or trying to take down Catholicism in some way, which I find very, very interesting, because it really, I think it calls into question the strength and fortitude not only of your own faith but of the thing that you're placing your faith in, when it cannot survive like scrutiny in the broad light of day and critical analysis. What is that actually saying about your organization, that it can't handle someone like me apparently coming along and asking these questions about shit that is out on the public web, publicly available information? What do you think that says about your organization or your religion, that someone like me coming along and asking these questions is apparently enough to elicit such ire and fury and anger from you, when all that I am doing is pointing out the state of affairs in reality as it actually is? I would think, and this continues to be a mystery to me, but I would think that if you are a Catholic who's actually invested in fully participating in the life of the church, in being a like active and healthy member of the body of Christ, that you would want these issues to be called out, to be dealt with, and to be exterminated from your religion, because they're actively hurting people. And the need to immediately jump in and defend the Catholic Church or Opus Dei from the truth is something that is endlessly fascinating to me. And I think it really calls into question the integrity of the thing being criticized, when it can't even handle the truth. So anyway, that's where I'm going to close this out for the time being. Just a reminder, all of the links are down below in the source document. Please feel free to have a look at those, and consider sharing this stream with someone who you think might get something out of it. Please do subscribe if you haven't already. Give this a thumbs up, all of those good things. Details to support my work and connect with me across social media are also linked down below. And I think that's where I am going to leave this for now. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being along for the journey and for making it very obvious that something as simple as just sitting here and reading these stories and reacting to the gravity of what they are revealing can at times be worth so much more than anyone ever wants to give it credit for. So thank you very much for giving me your time and attention and your support. And I will have a new video for you all very, very soon. But in the meantime, just remember, nolite te bastardes carborundorum. Don't let the bastards drag you down.